I didn't even let her finish her first sentence. Nathan Caldwell looked at Eliza Varga the way a man looks at something he ordered by mistake, with cold irritation and not a trace of shame. She had barely stepped off the train, her small suitcase still in her hand, when he held up one palm and said, loudly enough for every person on that platform to hear, "Stop. Just stop talking." The station went quiet. A child near the water barrel stopped moving. Two women near the ticket window turned to stare. "I asked for an American wife," Nathan said, his voice flat and final as a slammed door. "Not someone who sounds like she crawled out of a ditch in some country I can't even find on a map." Eliza stood there in the Kansas heat with the dust still settling around her shoes, and she understood, in the clearest, coldest way she had ever understood anything, that she had crossed an ocean to be humiliated in front of strangers. If that had been you standing on that platform, what would you have done? Before we follow Eliza into this story, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you. The ones about people who were knocked down so hard that most would have stayed down and didn't. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that platform, because what happened after Nathan Caldwell said those words was only the beginning. The train had come in from the east, running 2 hours late because of a cattle crossing outside of Dodge. And by the time it finally pulled into the Millhaven station, the afternoon sun was sitting low and mean over the Kansas plain, throwing long shadows across the wooden platform and baking the dust into something that got into your throat and stayed there. Eliza Varga had been on trains for 4 days. Before that, a steamship for 19 days. Before that, a smaller boat from her village to the port. Before that, a lifetime of waiting. She had not slept properly in almost a week, had eaten only what she could afford from the vendors who came through the cars, had washed her face with a handkerchief dampened from her canteen, and had spent the last 2 hours sitting absolutely still with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window, watching the American prairie go past her like a painting that never ended, flat and brown and enormous, and somehow beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are the opposite of everything you have ever known. She was 31 years old. She had dark eyes and strong hands, and a braid that she had pinned up the night before in the tiny rocking mirror of the sleeping car, trying to make herself look presentable. The dress she wore was her best. She had saved for it, a deep blue that had started the journey looking almost new, and had since acquired the particular weariness of clothes that have been worn and repinned and smoothed down too many times in too small a space. She had one suitcase. Everything she owned was in it. She had the letters, too, folded in the inside pocket of her coat. 31 letters, written over 8 months, from a man named Nathan Caldwell of Millhaven, Kansas, who had described himself as a banker, a landowner, a man of standing in his community, and a man who was, in his own careful words, looking for a partner, not just a wife. Someone educated, someone with character, someone who wasn't afraid of hard work and a frontier life. He had written to her through the agency in New York, the one that matched European women with American men who wanted to settle down and had the means to bring someone over. She had answered honestly. She told him about herself in careful English, which she had learned from a book and then from the schoolmaster in her village who had spent 2 years in London. She told him she had been a teacher, that she was good with numbers and had a head for organization, that she had grown up on a farm and understood livestock, that she was not delicate and did not expect to be treated like she was. He had written back within 3 weeks and said she sounded exactly right. 8 months of letters. 8 months of a slow, careful conversation across an ocean, each letter taking 3 weeks to arrive, each one read and reread, and carefully folded back into its envelope and kept in the wooden box on her windowsill. She had told her mother about him. She had told her sister. She had allowed herself, very cautiously, the way you allow yourself to believe in spring before the last frost is done, to imagine what her life might look like. Now she was stepping off the train at Millhaven Station with her suitcase in her right hand and her heart beating faster than she wanted it to, and she was scanning the platform for the man from the letters. She spotted him immediately. Nathan Caldwell was not hard to find. He was the most pressed man on the platform. Tall, silver-haired at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than most men in that station earned in a month. He stood apart from the other people who were waiting, slightly back from the edge of the platform, holding his hat in both hands with the particular posture of a man who is used to being looked at. He was watching the train doors. Eliza walked toward him. The platform was crowded, but families reuniting, freight being unloaded, a group of young men with dusty boots who looked like they'd been on the train since Colorado. She had to move around a woman with two small children and a mountain of baggage, and then she was past the crowd and in the open section of the platform where Nathan was standing, and she stopped about 6 feet from him and said, in English that was careful and clear and accented, "Mr. Caldwell, I am Eliza Varga. I am very glad to meet you." She had practiced that sentence for weeks. She had the vowels right. She had the emphasis right. She knew what it sounded like when she said it, like someone who had learned English from a book and from listening and from effort, like someone who did not have it as their first language but who had it, fully, with a mind behind it. What she saw happen in Nathan Caldwell's face when she spoke was something she had never seen directed at her before. Disgust, not surprise, not hesitation, not even the mild discomfort of a man adjusting his expectations. It was something harder and more immediate than that. A visible flinch, as if she had said something offensive, followed by a flattening of his expression that made his face go from the face of a man waiting to the face of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he was hoping was wrong. He held up his hand. "Stop!" Eliza stopped. "Just stop talking." The noise of the station continued around them. A porter was calling out arrival times. A child somewhere near the water barrel was laughing. But in the small circle of space where Eliza and Nathan were standing, everything had gone suddenly and completely quiet in the way that happens when something is said that nobody can unhear. "I asked for an American wife," Nathan said. He said it with the careful, deliberate enunciation of a man who is accustomed to being listened to. Not someone who sounds like she crawled out of a ditch in some country I can't even find on a map. Eliza's hand tightened on the handle of her suitcase. She did not say anything. Not because she had nothing to say. Her mind was already forming the words, the explanations, the careful points she had prepared for exactly this kind of moment. Because she had known, somewhere in the part of herself that had learned not to be naive, that this kind of moment might come. She said nothing because she was processing what was happening, which was this. The man she had spent 8 months writing letters to, the man who had told her she sounded exactly right, was standing in front of her and looking at her like she was a clerical error. The people nearby had noticed. A woman in a yellow bonnet near the freight office had turned to look. 2 station workers by the luggage cart had slowed their work without stopping it entirely. An older man smoking a pipe on the bench against the wall had shifted his eyes in their direction. Nathan stepped closer. Not in the way of a man offering comfort, in the way of a man who wanted to make sure he was heard. "I have a position in this town," he said. "I sit on the bank's board of directors. I have business relationships with half the county. I cannot bring home a wife who sounds like a carnival act every time she opens her mouth. Mr. Caldwell," I said, "stop." His voice had the edge in it now. Not loudness, exactly, but a kind of authority that had clearly never in his life been ignored. He looked down at her suitcase, then at her coat, then at her face, the way you evaluate something you are deciding to return. "The agency will hear about this," he said. "What they sent me is not what I requested. You can go back to wherever you came from." He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a small cloth bag, the kind you keep coins in, and he tossed it at her feet. Not handed it, tossed it. It landed in the dust of the platform with a soft, ugly sound that somehow cut through all the noise of the station. "For your trouble," he said. "Buy yourself a ticket back east." He put his hat on, turned, and walked back down the platform. The woman in the yellow bonnet looked away. The station workers went back to moving luggage. The older man with the pipe took a long draw and blew the smoke slowly upward. Eliza stood in the middle of the platform with the coin bag at her feet and her suitcase in her hand and the crowd of the station flowing around her like water around a rock. She did not pick up the coin bag immediately. She stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, looking at the wooden boards of the platform, at the thin line of dust that had settled around the bag when it landed. She was doing something that she had learned to do a long time ago, in her father's house, when her father had done something unkind and she had not allowed herself to cry in front of him. She was taking all of what she was feeling, The humiliation, the shock, the particular nauseating lurch of a hope that had been building for 8 months and had just been dropped from a great height. And she was putting it somewhere inside herself where she could still function, where she could still think. She picked up the coin bag. She put it in her coat pocket. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked to the end of the platform and sat down on the single bench there, away from most of the crowd, and she looked out at the town of Mill Haven, Kansas, and she tried to figure out what came next. What came next was nothing obvious. She had the money from the agency, the travel allowance, which was almost gone. She had the coins Nathan had thrown at her, which she hadn't counted yet, but which felt, from the weight, like maybe enough for a few nights in a modest room, if she could find one that would take her. She had the clothes in her suitcase, and the letters in her pocket, and the English she had learned, accent and all, which was, she understood now with a freshness that felt like a cut, apparently not what this town had been expecting. She thought about what she knew. She was in Mill Haven, Kansas. It was 1876. She had no employer, no husband, no family within 2,000 miles, and no clear path forward. She was a woman who had crossed an ocean based on a set of letters that had turned out to be a fiction. Not a lie, exactly, because Nathan Caldwell had clearly meant something when he wrote them, had meant to mean what he said, and had simply not understood until he heard her voice that he was the kind of man whose intentions went only as far as his comfort. She was not going back east. That she knew with a clarity that surprised her. It was not stubbornness, exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than stubbornness. It was the understanding that she had left her country, her family, everything she had built in 31 years of living, and that going back would mean going back empty, and she was not willing to do that. Not because it would be a defeat in the way other people defined defeat, but because she had made a decision to come here, and the decision had been real, had been hers, and she was not willing to let a man with a coin bag take it from her. She would find work. She stood up, picked up her suitcase, and walked into Mill Haven. The town was not small and not large. There was a main street with a bank, Nathan's bank, she supposed, and a general store and a hardware outfitter and a barber shop and a small hotel with a painted sign that had faded in the sun. There were side streets with houses, some of them with kitchen gardens visible over low fences. There was a livery stable at the end of the main street, and from somewhere behind the buildings she could hear what sounded like a lumber mill working. It was a functioning town. That meant it had needs. That meant there was work somewhere in it, if she could find her way to it. She went to the general store first. The man behind the counter was heavy and gray-haired and wearing an apron. He looked at her when she came in, and she could see in his face the particular calculation of a man who was trying to place her. Not in a hostile way. Not yet. Just in the way of someone trying to understand what he was looking at. "Good afternoon," Eliza said. "My name is Eliza Varga. I am looking for work. I have experience in keeping accounts, in teaching, and in the care of horses and livestock. I am reliable, and I learn quickly." The man's expression shifted when she spoke. Not to disgust, more to something cautious and uncertain, the way people look when they encounter something they don't know how to categorize. "Where are you from?" he said. "Eastern Europe." "Ah." He wiped the counter with a rag in a slow circle. I don't think we have anything. We're pretty well set for help right now. I'm also willing to help with cleaning or stock or—" "Miss." He set the rag down. He was not unkind, exactly. He had the quality of a man who was going to be as decent as his limitations allowed. "I've got customers who come in here every day. Regular people, you know. They might have trouble understanding. It's not about you being capable. It's just, I think you'd make things complicated." She thanked him and went to the hotel. The woman at the desk of the hotel heard her accent and told her the rooms were full. Eliza looked at the key hooks behind the desk, where more than half the hooks had keys on them, meaning more than half the rooms were empty, and she understood that full meant something different than its ordinary meaning. She went to 2 more establishments after that. A dressmaker who said she had all the help she needed, and a laundry operation at the back of a building on the second side street, run by an older woman who at least had the honesty to say, with a kind of tired regret, "Honey, the women who come here don't want their laundry handled by a foreigner. I know it's not right, but it's what it is." By the time the sun was 3/4 of the way down toward the horizon, Eliza had been rejected by 5 establishments and had spent an amount on a small, plain meal at the back of a lunch counter that she couldn't really afford. She sat on a low wall near the edge of the main street and thought. She was not, she reminded herself, a person without resources. She spoke 3 languages. She had taught reading and arithmetic and some natural science to children for 4 years in her village. She knew how to stretch food, how to treat the minor injuries of farm animals, how to keep books in 2 different accounting systems she'd learned from her father's business. She had made this entire trip alone, at 31, without anyone to help her, and she had done it competently. The problem was not her capability. The problem was that her capability was invisible to people who heard her accent and stopped listening. That was the problem she needed to solve. She was still sitting on the wall, working through this, when it happened. She heard it before she saw it, a sharp, rhythmic hammering of hooves on the dirt road, and the particular high, scraped sound of wagon wheels moving faster than wagon wheels were meant to move. Then the shouting. Then the wagon came around the bend at the far end of the street. 2 horses, dark with sweat, eyes white-rimmed and wild, running flat out and pulling a heavy freight wagon with a man in the seat who was hauling on the reins with both hands and getting nowhere. The horses were bolting. The street was not empty. There were people on it, a woman stepping out of the dressmaker's, 2 men talking in front of the hardware store, a boy carrying a sack, who had stopped to watch what was coming. They began moving, backing against walls, pulling each other sideways, getting clear. Nobody went toward the horses. Eliza was already on her feet. She didn't make a decision, exactly. Something older than decision took over. The part of her that had grown up watching her grandfather work with horses, that had spent summers in the barn because she loved the smell and the weight and the particular psychology of a frightened animal. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move, crossing the street at a diagonal that would put her just ahead of the horse's path, setting her suitcase down against the wall without looking, and positioning herself in the road with her hands slightly raised. She did not shout. She did not wave her arms. She spoke. In Hungarian, in the low and level and absolutely unhurried voice her grandfather had used, the one that communicated, not in any language, but in something beneath language, in tone and breath and the absence of fear, that everything was going to slow down now, that slowing down was safe, that there was no need to run from what was behind because what was in front was not a threat. The lead horse, a big bay, 18 hands at least, registered her, ears back, then forward, stride not breaking but shortening, just slightly. The second horse followed the first the way horses always did, because horses were animals that needed something to follow. Eliza kept talking. She moved slightly to the right, giving them an angle, not a wall. She kept her body loose and her voice steady, and she did not look away from the bay's eyes. 20 feet, 15, 10. The horses broke their run. Not all at once. It was a gradual surrender to something in the air between them and the woman in the road, something that said slow, 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 and they responded to it the way terrified animals responded to a calm they couldn't explain. By the time the bay was close enough for Eliza to reach up and take the bridle, the animal was at a fast walk and the second horse was matching it. She took the bridle. She held it. She kept talking. The wagon rolled to a stop. The man on the seat sat there for a moment with the reins slack in his hands, breathing hard, and the street was completely silent except for the horses and Eliza's voice, which was still going, still low, still steady, still in Hungarian. Then someone started talking, then someone else. Then the street came back to itself. The sounds of people recovering from a near thing, the particular loud energy of witnesses who had expected something terrible and hadn't gotten it. The man climbed down from the wagon. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors. He was maybe 40, wearing work clothes rather than town clothes, and there was no pretense in the way he looked at her. No calculation, no positioning. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they want to understand. "You talked them down," he said. "Yes." "In what language was that?" "Hungarian. It is what my grandfather taught me. The language does not matter to the horses. What matters is the tone." He was quiet for a moment, still looking at her. One of the horses, the bay, turned its head and pushed its nose against Eliza's shoulder, and she reached up without thinking and rubbed the flat place between its eyes. "My name is Caleb Walker," the man said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east. I've been looking for someone with horse sense for going on 3 months." "I am Eliza Varga," she said. I arrived on the afternoon train. Something moved across his face. A recognition of something. She wasn't sure what. From the station? She looked at him steadily. Yes, from the station. He seemed to do the math of this, or something like the math. He was not a man, she sensed, who needed things spelled out, but he was also not a man who pretended not to understand things he understood. The job pays $7 a month, he said. There's a small room off the barn, private, with its own door. My ranch hand, Miguel, and another woman, Mei Lin, live on the property. Meals are shared. The work is horses and whatever else needs doing. Eliza looked at him. You are offering me employment. That's what I said. You have not asked me for references. I watched you stop 2 running horses in the middle of a street without getting trampled, he said. That's a reference. She almost smiled. It was the first time since the train that anything in her chest had moved in the direction of something that was not dread or determination. I accept, she said. Caleb Walker nodded once, the way men who don't say unnecessary things nodded when a thing was settled. He went around to look at the horses, running his hands down the legs of the bay to check for injuries. Eliza stayed at the bay's head, still talking occasionally, keeping the animal quiet. What was that? Said a voice. Eliza turned. There was a woman standing nearby, maybe 60, with sharp eyes and an expression that was somewhere between impressed and confused. Not hostile, just working through something. The horses were frightened, Eliza said. I calmed them. I heard that. What was the language? Hungarian. Hungarian, the woman repeated as if tasting it. Never heard it before. Most people here haven't, Eliza said. The woman gave her a long look. Not unkind, just assessing, and then said, You're the girl from the station, Nathan Caldwell's. I am Eliza Varga, Eliza said. Her voice was calm. That is all I am. The woman looked at her for another moment, then made a small private sound that might have been approval and walked away. Caleb had finished with the horses. He straightened up and looked at her over the back of the bay. Can you drive a wagon? He said. Yes? Then you can drive us back to the ranch. I want to look at the undercarriage on this thing before I trust it again. She drove. It was 4 miles, as he'd said, and the road was not a good one, packed dirt with the particular unevenness of a route that had been made by people going somewhere, not by anyone thinking about the road itself. The sun was getting low now, and it cast a long gold light across the plain that was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with anything that had happened today, that existed independent of everything, the way the land did. Caleb sat beside her on the wagon bench. He did not try to fill the silence, which she appreciated. I was a man, she was already understanding, who was comfortable with quiet. After about 2 miles, he said, You came here as a mail-order bride. It wasn't a question. Yes, Eliza said, and Caldwell. He did not want me. She kept her eyes on the road. He felt I was unsuitable. He said this in front of a number of people at the station. A pause. I heard about that, Caleb said. News travels quickly. In Millhaven it does. He was quiet for a moment. He's the kind of man who would do that. You know him. Everyone in Millhaven knows Nathan Caldwell. He owns the bank. He's on the town board. He's the biggest man in a small pond and he knows it. Eliza said nothing. He's also, Caleb said more carefully, the kind of man who doesn't forget when someone makes him look bad. She understood the warning in this. She received it. I did not make him look bad, she said. He made himself look bad. I simply stood there. Caleb made a sound. It might have been a laugh, quiet and dry and not unkind. That's true, he said, but it won't matter to him. The ranch came into view as the sun touched the horizon. A main house, modest but solid, a large barn to the left, 2 smaller outbuildings, a paddock with 4 horses visible through the fence. It was working land. You could see that at a glance. Nothing decorative, everything functional, everything in a state of maintained use. A man came out of the barn as the wagon pulled in. Miguel, she would learn, who was Mexican and had been working with Caleb for 6 years, and who greeted the arrival of a new person with the careful and watchful neutrality of someone who had seen enough new people arrive to reserve judgment. He looked at Eliza without particular expression, and she nodded at him, and that was the beginning of their acquaintance. Mei Lin appeared from the direction of the small kitchen garden behind the house. She was Chinese, maybe 25, small and precise in her movements, with a watchfulness about her that Eliza recognized immediately as the particular alertness of someone who had learned that the world was not always safe. She looked at Eliza and Eliza looked at her, and something passed between them that was not yet friendship, but was the acknowledgement of a shared experience neither of them had to name. "New?" Maylin said to Caleb. "New," Caleb confirmed. "She talks horses down from bolts. She'll be in the room off the barn." Maylin looked at Eliza again, this time with something slightly different in her eyes. Not softness exactly, but a reduction in the wariness, an opening. "There's stew left," she said, "from supper." Eliza had not eaten a real meal since the morning. The relief of this was disproportionate, and she felt it move through her like something physical. "Thank you," she said. She sat at the table in the ranch kitchen and ate stew that Maylin had made with dried beans and tough beef, and something that tasted like it might be sage, and it was the best thing she had eaten in a week. Caleb sat across from her with a cup of coffee. Miguel had gone back to the barn. Maylin sat at the far end of the table, mending something, and did not speak, but her presence was not unwelcoming. "What did you teach?" Caleb said. "Reading, numbers, some natural history, children between 6 and 12. He nodded slowly. "We don't have a school here. Millhaven's been trying to organize one for 2 years. There are maybe 20 children in and around the ranch district who have nothing." "I know," Eliza said. "I noticed, coming through town, there is no school building." The town board, meaning Nathan Caldwell and 2 men who do what Nathan Caldwell says, decided a school was not a priority. Eliza looked at her bowl. "In my village," she said, "the school was also not a priority. Until the teacher arrived and started holding lessons anyway, in a barn, and after 2 years there was a school." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "That teacher," he said. "Was that you?" "My grandmother," Eliza said. "I only helped build the second classroom." He set his coffee cup down. "You are not what Nathan Caldwell thought he was getting," he said. "I'll say that." "No," Eliza said. "I am not." Outside, the Kansas night had settled in completely. Moonless and vast, the kind of dark that exists when you are far from cities and the sky overhead is nothing but stars. Eliza could hear the horses in the paddock, the occasional soft sound of movement, the sigh of an animal settling into sleep. She had arrived at this ranch carrying 1 suitcase, a pocket full of thrown coins, and the wreckage of a plan that had taken 8 months to build. She had arrived knowing no one. She had arrived already rejected by the first man she'd met and turned away by the establishments of an entire town. But she was sitting at a table with food in front of her and a roof over her head, and 2 people nearby who had not yet decided she wasn't worth their time. In the world she was learning, she was coming to understand that was not nothing. That was in fact more than many people ever got. She finished her stew. She said goodnight to Caleb and nodded at Maylin. She took the lamp she was given and walked to the small room off the barn, which had a cot and a hookah on the wall, and a window that looked out at the paddock, where the horses were shadows moving against the dark. She set her suitcase on the floor. She sat on the cot. She did not let herself feel everything yet. She would, eventually. She knew herself well enough to know that the accounting would come. The grief for the plan that had failed, the anger at the man who had made it fail, the fear of what came next. But she had learned, crossing an ocean on a ship where she could not afford to spend 19 days undone, to be careful about when she allowed herself to feel the full weight of things. You felt them when you could afford to. When the immediate crisis had passed, and you had a room with a door that locked, and a cot that would hold you. She would feel everything later. For now she lay back on the cot, still in her coat, and she looked at the wooden ceiling of the little room, and she listened to the horses. And she thought about the man with the coin bag, throwing it at her feet in front of an audience, and she thought about the 7 things she had noticed about him in those few minutes at the station. The way he held his hat, the way he looked at her clothing before her face, the way his voice had the practiced ease of a man who expected to win every argument he started. She filed those observations away. Not in anger, not yet. In the useful, careful way of a woman who had learned that information about powerful people who wished you harm was an asset, and that assets, properly held, had a way of mattering eventually. She closed her eyes. Outside, one of the horses made a low sound in the dark. She whispered something in Hungarian. Not a prayer, because she didn't pray, but something her grandfather used to say to the horses when he put them to bed. A kind of acknowledgement, a kind of good night. And for the first time since the train began its run into Kansas, Eliza Vargas slept. She woke before the horses did. That was unusual. At home, in the village, the horses had always been the first sound, the low, restless shifting that meant morning was coming before the sky knew it yet. But here, in this small room off the barn at Caleb Walker's ranch, she woke to silence, and for a long moment she did not know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The smell was wrong. The quality of the dark through the window was a different dark than the dark she knew. Then it came back to her, the way the previous day came back, in pieces and in order. The train, the platform, Nathan Caldwell's face, the coin bag hitting the dirt, the runaway horses, the stew, the cot. She lay still for a moment and took stock of herself. Her back hurt from the cot. Her eyes felt sandy from not enough sleep. There was a hollow quality to her chest that she recognized as the aftermath of sustained fear, the kind that didn't show itself while you needed to function and arrived afterward, like a bill you'd deferred. She allowed it for approximately 5 minutes, lying there in the dark with the weight of everything she'd lost settling on her in a way she hadn't permitted the night before. The plan. The letters. The 8 months of careful, hopeful correspondence that she had read and reread until she had most of them memorized. The future that had existed, vivid and detailed, in her imagination all the way across the ocean, and that had evaporated on a train platform in front of strangers in the time it took a man to hold up his hand. 5 minutes. Then she got up. She had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from hers. You gave grief its time, and then you got up, because the grief would still be there whenever you needed it, but the work would not wait. She washed her face with water from the basin someone had left in the room. She hadn't noticed it the night before, too tired. And she changed her dress and repinned her hair and picked up the lamp, which was burned low, and went to find the barn. The horses heard her coming and acknowledged her with the small sounds they made when something familiar approached. Small sounds that she knew were not for her specifically, not yet. She was still a stranger to them, but they were for the category of person who moved the way she moved and smelled the way she smelled, which was like someone who knew animals, and that was enough to begin with. She found a brush on a hook by the first stall and she started working on the nearest horse, a gray mare with a white blaze, before it was fully light outside. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was something to do with her hands while her mind sorted itself out, and because the mare seemed to want it, leaning into the brushstrokes with the unconscious pleasure of an animal that trusted the touch. She was halfway through the mare when Maylin appeared at the barn door. She stood there a moment, watching Eliza work, and Eliza watched her back, neither of them speaking. Maylin had a way of occupying a doorway, a stillness that was not passivity but observation, the gathering of information before committing to anything. Eliza had the sense, looking at her, that Maylin had learned to read rooms and people and situations very carefully, and that this carefulness was not a personality trait, but a survival skill. "Early," Maylin said finally. "Old habit," Eliza said. Maylin stepped into the barn. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and she held one out in Eliza's direction. Eliza set down the brush and took it, and the coffee was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what she needed. "How long have you been here?" Eliza asked. "At the ranch?" 3 years. Maylin wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I came from California, from the railroad camps. The man I came with died in an accident, blasting. I had nothing." She said this without excessive emotion, the way people stated facts about hard things when the hard things were far enough behind them. "I walked east for 2 weeks, and then I was here. Caleb gave me work." "He seems to do that," Eliza said. "He does." Maylin looked at the mare. "He lost his wife 4 years ago. Fever. His son too, the same week. After that he didn't care much about what the town thought of his decisions." Eliza absorbed this. The coffee was cooling slightly in her hands. She thought about the way Caleb had looked at her at the station. Not with assessment, but with something more direct than that. The way you looked at the thing itself, rather than the idea of the thing. "The town is going to talk," Eliza said, "about me being here." "The town already talked," Maylin said. "Last night. By the time you were eating supper, the story of what happened at the station was in every kitchen in Millhaven, and then when people heard you stopped that wagon." She paused. "There were 2 versions by nightfall. One where you were a dangerous foreign woman who had tricked your way here. One where you were some kind of miracle. Depends on who you ask. And Nathan Caldwell? Maylin's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. He will not like that you are still here, she said. Men like that. When they throw someone away and the person doesn't leave, it bothers them, more than you would think. Eliza thought about what Caleb had said in the wagon. He's the kind of man who doesn't forget when someone makes him look bad. She had not yet determined the full geometry of the situation she was in, but she was beginning to see the shape of it. She picked up the brush and went back to the mare. "What do I need to know about the horses?" she said. Maylin looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. "I'll show you," she said. The first 2 weeks at Caleb's ranch had the particular texture of a life being rebuilt from materials that were not quite what you would have chosen. Eliza worked. She worked the way she had always worked when things were uncertain, steadily, methodically, with her attention on what was directly in front of her rather than on the larger questions she couldn't yet answer. She learned the horses. There were 7 of them. The gray mare, 2 bays, a black gelding with a bad habit of nipping when he was bored, a young roan that had been spooked badly in a storm and was still flinchy, and 2 workhorses that had no particular character faults but were tired in a deep way, the tiredness of animals that had been worked too hard for too long. She spent most of the first week on the roan. His name, according to Miguel, was Copper, though Miguel said it with the slight irony of a man who hadn't named him but had inherited the name along with the horse. Copper was afraid of approximately everything: sudden sounds, shadows at the wrong angle, the sight of anything flapping in the wind. And the fear expressed itself in shying and rearing, and one occasion where he put Miguel into the fence rail hard enough to leave a bruise across his ribs that was visible for a week. Eliza did not rush him. She sat with him. She talked to him, in Hungarian mostly, sometimes in English, once in the smattering of German she'd picked up from a neighbor in her village. What she was doing, she knew, had less to do with language than with the message in her body. She was not in a hurry. She was not afraid. There was nothing in the air between them that required urgency. An anxious horse, she had learned from her grandfather, was not stupid. It was responding logically to something it perceived as danger, and the way you helped it was not to override the fear but to be, consistently and without drama, evidence that the fear was unfounded. By the end of the first week, Copper would take grain from her hand without flinching. Miguel watched this from across the paddock with an expression that was still reserved but had shifted slightly towards something that might, in time, become respect. He did not say anything about it, but the following Monday he asked her, in careful English that suggested he also knew what it was to speak a language that wasn't the one he'd grown up with, whether she had any thoughts about the black gelding's nipping. "He's bored," Eliza said. "He's smart, and he doesn't have enough to do. Give him something to figure out, and he'll stop looking for trouble." Miguel considered this. "Like what?" "Teach him to pick something up and carry it. They can learn that. It gives them a job." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not something I've heard before." "My grandfather kept horses for 40 years, Eliza said. He said the ones that caused trouble were almost always the ones that were smart enough to be bored." Miguel nodded slowly, the way men nodded when they were turning an idea over and finding it held up. He didn't commit to anything, but 2 days later she came to the barn to find him working with the gelding and a worn leather glove, the beginning of exactly what she'd described. She didn't say anything about it. She went about her work. It was Caleb who first asked her to do something beyond the horses. He found her one evening after supper, sitting on the fence rail of the paddock, watching the horses in the last light, and he stood beside her for a few minutes not saying anything, which she had already learned was how he approached things, letting silence do some of the work first. "I've got a problem with my accounts," he said finally. She waited. "The man I used to use for books was a fellow named Hatch. He left in February to go to Colorado. I've been doing it myself since then, and I've made a mess." "What kind of mess?" "The kind where I know money is going somewhere and I can't find where." Eliza looked at him sideways. "How long ago did you start noticing?" "January, maybe December. There was a discrepancy in the winter quarter that I couldn't account for, and I figured I'd done something wrong. But then it happened again in the spring, and—" He stopped. "I'm not bad with numbers, but I'm not trained. And there's something in there that doesn't add up. May I look at them?" He seemed to have been hoping she would offer, but not wanting to ask directly. He brought the ledgers to the kitchen table that evening after Mei Lin and Miguel had gone to their respective rooms, and Eliza sat down with them, and the lamp turned up high and went through them the way her father had taught her, which was column by column, and then backward, and then again looking for the pattern of where things didn't match. It took her 2 hours. What she found was not, in the end, complicated. It was actually quite simple, which was part of what made it troubling. There were payments recorded to a supplier called Harmon and Sons, feed primarily, and some lumber, that did not correspond to any delivery records she could find. Small amounts, individually. Across 6 months, they added up to something that was not small at all. She sat back and looked at the ledger for a moment. "Caleb," she said. He looked up from the cup of coffee he'd been nursing for an hour. "Someone has been paying Harmon and Sons for goods you have not received," she said, "or the payments are being recorded and the money is going somewhere else. Either way, this is not an accounting error." He was quiet for a long time. "Harmon and Sons," he said. "Do you know them?" "Henry Harmon runs the feed supply on the east end of Main Street." He set the coffee cup down. "He and Nathan Caldwell went to school together. They are close." Eliza looked at him. "You think Caldwell is involved," she said. "I don't know what I think yet." He was careful, measuring his words. "What I know is that my accounts are wrong, and the wrong amounts are going to a man who is friends with someone who has reason to want my ranch to fail." The words sat between them for a moment. Fail. "How close is it?" Eliza said. "Ed, to failing." He looked at the ledger rather than at her. "If this has been going on as long as it looks like it's been going on, and if the summer accounts show the same," he stopped, "I'd be looking at a very difficult winter." Eliza folded her hands on the table. She thought about the man at the station, the coin bag, the way he'd thrown it without looking at her face. She thought about Maylene saying, "He will not like that you are still here." She thought about the careful, systematic nature of what she was seeing in the ledger. Not a sudden grab, but a slow, patient drain, the kind of thing that was designed to be discovered too late. "We need to document this," she said. "Everything, every discrepancy, every payment, every date. We need it written clearly and kept somewhere safe. And then? And then we need to understand whether there is someone in this territory with the authority to do something about it." She looked at him directly. "Is there a sheriff who is not in Nathan Caldwell's pocket?" Caleb considered this longer than she would have liked. "Partly," he said finally. "Sheriff Drummond does what Caldwell wants on things that matter to Caldwell. But he has a deputy, young man named Ellis. He's been here about a year, who I think is honest. He's just new and careful." "Careful is good," Eliza said. "Careful means he hasn't been ruined yet." Caleb looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between assessment and a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. "You're thinking about this very practically," he said. "I am a practical person. Most people, when they find out someone's been stealing from them, they get angry first." "I am angry," Eliza said, "but anger is for later. Right now the ledger is for now." She started copying figures that night. Over the following week, the situation with the accounts became the second thing she worked on, running parallel to the horses like a second track of the same journey. She was methodical about it. She set up a separate ledger, her own, bought from the general store by Maylin because Eliza did not yet want to be seen in Millhaven more than necessary. And she entered every discrepancy she could find in Caleb's books, cross-referenced against what delivery records existed, organized by date and amount. Maylin knew something was happening. She asked about it on the third evening, watching Eliza work at the kitchen table. "The accounts?" she said. "Yes." Caleb told me a little. Maylin sat down across from her. "Is it Caldwell?" "We don't know yet. There's a man named Harmon who seems to be the mechanism. Whether Caldwell is behind it?" Eliza looked up from the page. "We need more information." Maylin was quiet for a moment. Then, "I can go into town. People don't watch what they say around me. They think I'm not listening." The bitterness in this was flat and matter-of-fact, not hot. She'd said it too many times to herself for it to have heat anymore. "I hear things." Eliza looked at her. "What kind of things?" "Harmon's been spending money he shouldn't have. New coat, new boots. His wife has a new brooch that people are talking about. He works feed supply, so he doesn't have money for that kind of thing, normally." Maylin folded her hands on the table. And there's something else. The Dawson Farm, 2 miles north of here. The Dawsons lost their land last spring, bank loan that came due at a strange time. The Caldwell Bank. Eliza absorbed this slowly. How many farms, she said. That I know of? 3? Maybe 4? It's hard to tell because people don't talk about it directly. They leave and they don't say why, and then the land is gone, absorbed, sold to someone who turns out to be connected to the bank. The shape of it was becoming clearer. Not just Caleb's ranch. A pattern. A systematic process of destabilization. Small financial pressures, manufactured discrepancies, loans called in at inconvenient moments, designed to clear land and consolidate it in the hands of someone who already had more than most. And Nathan Caldwell, who sat on the bank's board of directors, who was friends with the feed supply man, who had the ear of the sheriff. Eliza set down her pen. He's taking the land, she said. Maylin looked at her steadily. He's been taking it for 2 years, maybe longer. And no one has... Who would they tell? Maylin's voice was quiet and completely level. The sheriff is his. The newspaper man is his. Caldwell advertises in the paper, and the editor knows it. The judge comes through twice a year and stays at Caldwell's house when he does. She paused. The people it's happening to are farmers and immigrants and people who don't have connections. They just disappear. Eliza looked out the window into the dark Kansas night. She thought about the train station, about standing there with her suitcase and the coin bag in the dust. She thought about all the doors that had been closed to her in a single afternoon. The general store, the hotel, the dressmaker, the laundry. And she thought about how easy it would have been to believe, in the face of all of that this was simply how things were, that the territory organized itself this way naturally, that some people simply mattered and some didn't. But she had spent 31 years among people who had power over her, landlords, local officials, the social structures of a small village in Eastern Europe. And she had learned to look at power not as weather, not as something you simply endured, but as a mechanism. A mechanism had pieces. Pieces could be understood. Things that could be understood could sometimes be disrupted. She picked up her pen. Then we build something they can't ignore, she said. Documentation, testimony, numbers, in writing, with dates, with names. And what do we do with it? We wait until it is complete enough to be undeniable. And then we find the one person in a position of authority who isn't in Caldwell's pocket, and we put it in front of them. Maylin looked at her for a long moment. You came here thinking you were going to be a banker's wife, she said. It was not unkind. I came here thinking a great many things, Eliza said. Most of them were wrong. And yet here you are. And yet here I am. The night that the trouble came to the ranch directly started quietly, the way most bad nights started. With nothing, with ordinary dark and ordinary sound, with Eliza asleep on the cot in the room off the barn, and the horses settled and the lamp burned out. What woke her was the horses, not the roan. Copper was still skittish enough that she had developed the habit of tracking his sounds in her sleep, the way a mother tracked the breathing of a child. But this was all of them, the collective shift of 7 animals who had sensed something wrong before the human part of the ranch had caught up with it. The shuffling, the low, uncertain sounds, the quality of alertness that had no single source. She was up and at the door before she was fully awake. The night outside was dark, no moon, but she had been on the ranch long enough to know its shadows, and the shadow at the far end of the paddock fence was wrong. It was a shape that shouldn't have been there, and it was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone trying not to make noise. She didn't have time to wake Caleb. She didn't have a weapon. She stepped back inside, picked up the handle of the water bucket, heavy, iron, and went back to the door and said, in her clearest English and her loudest voice, I see you. I have a rifle. You have about 10 seconds to decide. The shape went still. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then it moved. Away from the fence, away from the paddock, back toward the road, in a low, hurried crouch that was not a run, but was moving as fast as it could, while still pretending to be something other than a retreat. Eliza stood in the doorway with the water bucket until she couldn't hear footsteps anymore. Then her hands started shaking. She let them shake for a moment, standing there in the dark, because there was nobody watching. Then she set the bucket down and went to wake Caleb. He came out fast and clear-headed in the way of men who were accustomed to being woken for emergencies. He listened to what she said without interrupting. Then he walked the fence line with a lamp, and what he found was this: a section of fence on the far side of the paddock, near the gate, that had been worked on. Not broken yet, but the posts loosened, the wire coaxed in a way that would have looked fine in daylight and would have failed before morning, releasing 7 horses into the open prairie. He looked at the fence for a long time. "They weren't here to take the horses," he said. Eliza, standing beside him with her arms crossed against the night cold, said, "No. Losing 7 horses in the dark would have looked like an accident, or like negligence." He looked at her. "A man whose horses are all gone doesn't ranch anymore. A man whose horses are all gone also can't make payments on a loan that's been quietly drawn down," Eliza said. "He fails. His land becomes available. The bank acquires it at distressed price." Caleb stood with the lamp in his hand and the dark Kansas plain all around them and looked at the loosened fence posts for another moment. "How long do you think this has been planned?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but the accounts go back at least to winter, and what Mei Lin told me about the other farms. Some of them lost their land in the spring, which means the pressure on them probably started last summer or before." She pulled her coat tighter. "This is not impulsive. This is someone who takes their time." Caleb drove a fence post back into the ground with his boot heel, a single decisive motion. "Then we take our time too," he said. They went back inside. Eliza did not sleep again that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and her pen, and she worked until the sky began to gray outside the window. And when Mei Lin came in to start the stove for breakfast, she found Eliza still there, surrounded by papers, with the lamp turned low. Mei Lin looked at the papers. She looked at Eliza. She set a hand briefly on Eliza's shoulder. A light touch, there and gone, not a word but something that carried the weight of one. Then she put the kettle on. It was 4 days later that Eliza went back to Mill Haven for the first time since arriving. She went with Mei Lin on the pretense of buying flour and lamp oil, and she kept her face composed and her pace steady as they walked down the main street, and she felt the awareness of her on the street. The turned heads, the quick looks, the murmured comments that people did not bother to muffle much because they assumed she either wouldn't understand or wouldn't matter. She understood. And she was paying attention. She saw Nathan Caldwell once. He was coming out of the bank as she and Mei Lin were crossing to the dry goods store, and he looked up and saw her, and something moved across his face that she filed away carefully. Not anger, exactly. Something more complicated than anger. Something that a person who had expected a problem to resolve itself felt when they looked up and saw it still standing in the street. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She looked back. Then he put his hat on, turned, and walked in the other direction. Mei Lin, beside her, said nothing, but her hand, at her side, was very slightly less tense than it had been. On the way back to the ranch, the flour and lamp oil in the wagon bed, Mei Lin said, "He'll move faster now." "I know," Eliza said. "We need to move faster too. I know that too." The road back to the ranch ran east through the flat country, and the afternoon light lay across it long and gold and indifferent, the way the light here seemed to exist independent of anything that happened underneath it. Eliza held the reins with both hands and kept her eyes on the road. She thought about the deputy, Ellis, who was careful, who had not yet been ruined. She thought about the ledger, which was nearly complete. She thought about the fence post, the loosened wire, the shape in the dark that had retreated. She thought about Nathan Caldwell's face when he looked at her across the street, the thing that was more complicated than anger. It was, she thought, something closer to the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was beginning to suspect he'd made it wrong. She had come to Mill Haven, Kansas, as a woman who was supposed to disappear, rejected, discarded, sent back to wherever she came from. She had not disappeared. She was sitting in a wagon on the road back to a ranch where she had work and shelter, and 2 people who were, in the cautious and practical way of people who had all been discarded by something, becoming her people. And she had, in 6 weeks, learned more about Nathan Caldwell's operation than he likely knew she knew. She was not, she reminded herself, someone who had anything yet. Not a solution, not safety, not even a clear plan beyond the next step. The ledger was not yet complete. The deputy was not yet contacted. The ranch was still vulnerable in a dozen ways she couldn't fully predict. But she had not disappeared, and she had learned in 31 years of being underestimated that disappearing was the thing people who wanted to destroy you most depended on. The horses kept their pace. The road ran east. The light held. The ledger was finished on a Tuesday. Eliza knew it was finished not because she had run out of things to document. There were always more threads to pull, more dates to cross-reference, more small inconsistencies that revealed themselves when you looked at the numbers long enough. But because she had reached the point where what she had was sufficient. Sufficient was a word her father had used in his business. Not perfect, not exhaustive, but enough to stand on. The ledger had 41 documented discrepancies across 8 months, totaling an amount that would have made a serious dent in any working ranch's operating capacity. She had cross-referenced each entry against what delivery records existed, had noted the dates, had written the name Harmon and Sons in her careful schoolteacher's hand next to each one, and had drawn up a summary page at the front that laid it all out in the plainest English she could manage. She put it in the wooden box under her cot, next to the letters from Nathan Caldwell that she had not thrown away. She had not thrown them away because she had understood, from the moment she picked up the coin bag off the platform, that documentation of any kind had value you couldn't always predict in advance. The week after she finished the ledger was the week the pressure shifted. It started with the feed delivery. Caleb had placed an order with a supplier in the next county, not Harmon, whom he had quietly stopped using without making a formal statement of it, for the quantities of grain and hay that would carry them through to the fall. The order was confirmed. The delivery was scheduled. On the morning it was supposed to arrive, it didn't. Caleb waited until noon and then sent Miguel to find out what had happened, and Miguel came back 3 hours later with a look on his face that was the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he knew was not good. "The supplier says the order was canceled," Miguel said. Caleb looked at him across the paddock fence. "I didn't cancel it." "He says he got a letter, with your signature." Miguel paused. "I asked to see it. He showed me. The signature it looks like yours, but it's not." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Eliza, who was working nearby with copper and had heard the whole thing, did not turn around. She kept her hands on the horse and her eyes on the fence post across the paddock, and she listened to Caleb not saying anything for a longer moment than most men could sustain. "Forged," Caleb said finally. Not a question. "Yes." Another silence. Then, "Who brought the letter to him?" "He says a boy. Young, maybe 14. He didn't know him." Caleb set his hands on the fence rail and looked out at the plain for a moment. Eliza heard him take a breath and let it out through his nose, the specific exhale of a man managing his temper with the awareness that losing it would not help. "All right," he said. "I'll find another supplier. It'll cost more and take longer." He looked at Miguel. "In the meantime, we ration what we have. Start with the workhorses. They can go to grass for now. The pasture's still good." Miguel nodded and went. Caleb turned and looked at Eliza. She turned away from Copper and looked back at him. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." The fence was one thing. That was a test, or a first move. This is different. A forged letter is something that takes planning. It took someone who could approximate your handwriting or who was willing to produce something close enough to pass to a man who doesn't know you well. Caleb came around the fence and stood near her, not close enough to be uncomfortable, just close enough to talk without carrying their voices across the yard. "Harmon," he said. "He's handled my orders before. He's seen my writing." Then Harmon produced the letter, or produced a copy of your hand for someone else to copy. She thought for a moment. "This means they know we've stopped using Harmon, which means they're watching closely enough to have noticed." Or Harmon told them. Yes, or that. The implication of this settled between them. If Harmon was reporting back on the ranch's activities, which seemed likely given what Eliza had found in the ledger, then the people working against them had information. Not complete information, not necessarily, but enough to know that something had changed, that the ranch was not proceeding along the path of slow, oblivious decline that had apparently been planned for it. That was dangerous. But it was also, Eliza thought, a kind of information in itself. They were escalating because something had changed, and things changed because they had been noticed. "We need to move on the deputy," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Ellis." "Yes. I know the timing isn't what we wanted. I wanted the ledger to be more complete, to have testimony from some of the other families who've lost land. But if they're moving this fast—" She stopped. "We can't wait until we have everything. We need to put what we have in front of someone now. He looked at her for a moment in the way she'd learned to read. Not doubt, but the processing of risk. The careful accounting of a man who had grown up on land and knew that the difference between a good decision and a bad one was sometimes just the timing. "I'll go to Ellis tomorrow," he said. "Alone. If I walk in there with you, it'll be—" "I know," she said. "Go alone." He went alone. He came back that evening with a report that was neither good nor bad, but was something more complicated than either. Ellis had listened. He was 26 years old, according to Caleb, and had the quality of a young man who had gone into law enforcement because he genuinely believed in its purpose, which in Mill Haven in 1876 was a quality that made him both useful and isolated. He had looked at the summary page Caleb had brought. Eliza had prepared a clean copy, her clearest hand, 2 pages, and he had asked good questions, specific questions, the kind of questions you only asked if you were actually trying to understand something rather than find reasons to put it down. But he said he can't move without the sheriff's knowledge, Caleb said, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. Drummond has to approve any formal investigation. Mei Lin, across the table, made a sound. It was a small sound, but it contained a full paragraph's worth of commentary. "And Drummond," Eliza said. Ellis was careful about what he said, but the way he was careful— Caleb shook his head slightly. He said there were proper channels, that he'd have to present the information to his superior first. "Which means Caldwell will know about it within a day of Ellis telling Drummond," Mei Lin said. "Maybe less," Caleb said. Eliza looked at the table. She had been half expecting this. The structure of power in Mill Haven was not complicated. It was the same structure she had seen operate in her village, in the county offices of her home country, in every place she had ever lived where one man had accumulated enough of what other people needed that his preferences became the shape of how things worked. The particular form it took changed. The mechanism was always the same. "There is a circuit judge," she said. "You mentioned him before. He comes through twice a year. Harding. He comes in September and March. When was he last here?" "March. So September." She looked up. "That's 2 months. 2 months is a long time," Caleb said. 2 months is also a specific target," Eliza said. If we can keep the ranch operating and build the documentation further, and perhaps get testimony from some of the other families before September, we go over Drummond's head entirely. Judge Harding stays at Caldwell's house, you said. But a judge with written evidence placed in front of him, with multiple witnesses, in a formal setting, she paused. That's harder to ignore than a sheriff who already knows which side his bread is on. He'd have to act, Miguel said. He had been quiet in the corner, listening with the focused stillness of a man who had learned that the best time to speak was when you had something worth saying. A judge who ignores documented fraud in front of witnesses has a problem of his own afterward. The table was quiet for a moment. 2 months, Caleb said again. He said it differently this time, less like an obstacle, more like a calculation. 2 months, Eliza said. The first thing that broke in that 2 months was not the ranch. It was the town. It started with the school. Eliza had been thinking about it since her first week. The 20 children Caleb had mentioned scattered across the ranch district with nothing. No teacher, no building, no instruction. It was a need that existed independent of everything else that was happening. And she was a teacher, and needs that existed independent of everything else had a way of pulling at her, the way a loose thread pulled at the corner of a weaving. She mentioned it to Caleb on a Thursday evening, carefully, the way you mention things to a man whose ranch was under siege and whose attention was already stretched. I know it's not the right time, she said, but the children— Use the barn, he said. Saturday mornings, Miguel can clear the south end. It was that simple. Or rather, it was not that simple at all. What made it seem simple was that Caleb Walker had long ago stopped asking what Millhaven would think of his decisions. But in practical terms, the conversation lasted about 45 seconds and resulted in the beginning of a school. She sent word through Mei Lin, who went into town on her regular errands and spoke to the women she knew, the ones who knew her, who had learned to see past the surface assessment that most of the town still applied. There were more of them than Eliza had expected. Women who had come from somewhere else, or whose husbands had come from somewhere else, or who simply had children and had long given up waiting for the town board to provide what they needed. The first Saturday, 7 children appeared at the barn. They ranged from 6 to 13, and they were the particular mix of shy and unruly that children were when placed in an unfamiliar situation. Some pressed close to the wall, some immediately began climbing on things. One boy of about 9 sat down in the middle of the barn floor and announced that he didn't see the point of any of this. "That's a fair position," Eliza said. "What would be more useful to you?" He looked at her accent with the frank assessment of a child who had not yet learned to hide what he thought. "My pa says readings for people who don't have real work." "Can your pa do his accounts himself?" The boy blinked. Mostly. He has trouble sometimes. If you could read and do arithmetic, you could help him. You could also make sure that when someone writes him a contract, he understands everything in it." She paused. "Do you know what a contract is?" "Something you sign. It's something you sign that tells you what you owe and what you're owed. If you can't read it, you're trusting the person who wrote it to be honest about what it says." She let that sit for a moment. "Is everyone your father does business with honest?" The boy was quiet. "Sit down wherever you like," Eliza said. "We'll start with numbers." By the third Saturday, there were 14 children. By the fifth, a mother stayed, a woman named Clara Brandt, whose husband had lost 40 acres to the Caldwell Bank the previous spring, and who sat in the corner of the barn with her mending and watched what happened with an expression that moved over the course of the morning from cautious to something else. At the end of that session, when the children had gone, Clara Brandt approached Eliza. "My husband signed something last year," she said. "A renewal on the loan. I didn't." He read well enough, but the language in it was... She stopped. "We didn't understand what we were agreeing to. And then in March they said we were in violation of a clause and they called the loan." Eliza looked at her steadily. "Do you still have the document?" "Thomas kept it. I don't know why. There was nothing we could do with it, but he kept it." "I would very much like to see it," Eliza said, "if your husband would allow it." Clara Brandt looked at her, at the accent, the foreign face, the woman who had arrived at the station as a rejected bride and who was now teaching her children in a rancher's barn. She was doing the calculation that people did, the one that asked whether the risk of trust was less than the risk of staying exactly where she was. "I'll ask him," she said. Thomas Brandt came to the ranch on a Wednesday evening with his wife and the document in question and the tight, set expression of a man who had been swallowing humiliation for months and had not yet found a place to put it. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Eliza with something short of warmth and sat at the kitchen table and put the document in the middle of it. Eliza read it once quickly, then again slowly. The clause in question was on the 3rd page, buried in language that was technically English, but assembled in a way that was designed to be difficult to parse on a first read, or a second. What it said, stripped of the deliberate complexity, was that the loan could be called in full upon 30 days' notice if the bank determined, at its sole discretion, that the property's productive capacity had materially declined. "Materially declined," Eliza said. "They said the harvest last fall was insufficient," Thomas Brandt said. "We had a dry summer. Half the county had a dry summer. But they said ours specifically was..." "Did they produce documentation? A surveyor's assessment? Crop records?" He stared at her. "No, they said it." Eliza put the document down carefully. "This clause is real," she said. "It is in the contract. But the determination of material decline, if they made that determination without documentation, without an independent assessment, and if the standard they applied to you was not applied to other borrowers in similar conditions..." She paused. "That is not a legal exercise of the clause. That is a pretextual exercise of it." Thomas Brandt looked at her for a long moment. "What does that mean?" "It means they used a real tool for a false purpose," she said. "And if we can show that the bank applied this standard selectively, only to certain properties, only to certain owners, then the foreclosure is challengeable." The kitchen was very quiet. "You can show that?" he said. "I don't know yet. I need to see whether other families lost their land under similar circumstances. I need the documents, if they have them, and I need time." She looked at him directly. 2 months. He looked at his wife. She looked back at him. "We've already lost the land," he said. "I know. What I'm working toward is something larger than one farm." She kept her voice level. "What's being done to your family is being done to others, documenting the pattern, showing that it is a pattern, deliberate and orchestrated. is different from challenging one foreclosure. A judge presented with a pattern has no reasonable basis to ignore it. Thomas Brandt sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man who had stopped believing that the right people would do the right thing, and who was in the process of deciding whether to believe it again, just once more, for possibly the last time. "I'll talk to the Hendersons," he said finally, "and the Kowalskis. They lost land too. I don't know if they kept their papers." "Ask them," Eliza said, "whatever they have." After the Brandts left, Caleb sat across from Eliza at the kitchen table for a long moment without speaking. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm building several cases," she said, "and hoping they add up to something one case couldn't be. This is more than what happened to my accounts." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You came here to be someone's wife." "I came here to have a life," Eliza said. "This," she gestured, a small sweep of her hand that took in the ledger and the kitchen and the absent Brandts and the whole accumulating weight of what the past 2 months had become. "This is a life." He looked at her for a moment in the way he had of looking at things he wasn't ready to say something about. Then he got up to refill the coffee. The attack on the barn came on a Friday night, 3 weeks before the circuit judge was due in Mill Haven. They smelled it before they saw it. The particular thick petroleum smell of something burning that wasn't supposed to be burning, and then the orange light at the edge of the darkness, and then the sound of the horses screaming. Eliza was out the door of her room before she was fully awake for the second time in 2 months, but this time there was no shadow to face down with a water bucket. This time the fire was real, and it was in the barn, and the horses were in the barn, and nothing in her mind at that moment was functioning the way minds were supposed to function, except the part that knew where the horses were and how to get to them. Caleb was already at the barn door. Miguel was behind him. The fire was in the loft. Hay burning in the loft, which was the worst possible place for a barn fire to start because hay burned fast and it burned above everything else, and the smoke came down. "The doors," Caleb said. Eliza was already at the first stall. She pulled the latch and shoved the door open, and the gray mare came through it like she'd been waiting for exactly this, which she had. Animals understanding fire, the way they understood all danger, completely and without the complicated layer of disbelief that made humans waste time. The mare went out the main door, and Eliza was already at the second stall, the bay, and she got it open and went to the third. The smoke was getting heavy. Her eyes were burning. She was not breathing right because there wasn't right air to breathe, just the thick, acrid stuff that fire made when it consumed things that had been stored and dried over a long summer. The black gelding, the bored one, the nipper, did not want to come out of his stall. He was pressed against the back wall with his eyes rolling, and Eliza understood in the instant of looking at him that he had crossed the line from terrified but functional to the particular paralysis that sometimes overtook animals when fear became too large to move through. She didn't have time. She pulled her coat over her face, went into the stall, got her hand on his halter, and she spoke in Hungarian directly into his ear from about 3 inches away, her voice as low and steady as she could make it with smoke in her lungs, and her own heart hammering loud enough that she could hear it. She had no idea what she said. She said whatever came out, the old words from the old way, and she pulled, and the gelding moved, and they came out of the stall together, and through the main door and into the open night air, and the horse kept going, and so did Eliza, on her hands and knees in the dirt, coughing until she couldn't cough anymore. Caleb was there. His hands were on her shoulders. "Are you—" "The horses," she said. "They're out. All of them. Miguel has them in the north pasture." He kept his hands on her shoulders. "Eliza, are you hurt?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were still streaming from the smoke, and her throat felt like she'd swallowed the fire itself, and she was shaking in a way she wasn't entirely in control of, the body's delayed accounting of what had just happened. "No," she said, "I'm not hurt." The barn burned. They had gotten the horses out, and they had gotten themselves out, and there was nothing to be done about the structure once it reached a certain point, except to keep it from spreading to the house. They formed a line, Caleb and Miguel and Eliza, when she could stand steadily enough. And they did what they could with the water, which wasn't much, but the wind was quiet that night, and the house was far enough away that in the end only the barn was lost. By morning it was ashes and blackened posts, and the smell of burned wood and hay that would stay in the air for days. Maylin had appeared at some point during the night. Eliza didn't know when exactly, time had behaved strangely, and had stood at the edge of the yard with a bucket and her face very controlled, the way Maylene's face was controlled when she was keeping herself together by force of will. They stood together in the early morning looking at what was left. "He knows," Maylene said. "Yes," Eliza said, "about the judge, about the documents. He must, or he suspects, or he has decided that whether we have something or not, making us fail before September is more valuable than finding out what we know. We have nowhere to put the horses. The north pasture for now. Miguel is with them." Eliza looked at the ruins. "The ledger is safe. The documents are safe. I moved them when—" She stopped. She had in fact moved the wooden box 3 weeks ago, after the forged letter, to a location she had discussed with no one. A hollow in the floor of the small outbuilding on the far side of the property, covered with a board that looked like every other board. She had not told Caleb. She had not told Maylene. She had not told anyone, because she had learned a long time ago that a secret kept entirely by one person was safer than a secret shared in good faith. "Where?" Maylene said. "Safe," Eliza said. "That's all you need to know." Maylene looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her expression. Not offense, exactly, but a recognition that this was how things had to be, and a tiredness about having to operate in a world where this was how things had to be. "All right," she said. Caleb came to stand with them. He had soot on his hands and on one side of his face, and he was looking at the ashes with an expression that Eliza could not read entirely. The particular grief of a man looking at something he'd built or maintained, something that had been part of the landscape of his life for long enough that its absence was not just a practical problem, but a personal one. "We rebuild," Eliza said. He looked at her. "I know it seems—" she started. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped. He looked at the ashes for another moment. "My wife and I built that barn the first summer we were here. She was 6 months pregnant, and she handed me boards." He said it quietly, not for effect, just because it was true, and it was there. "It burned before. A lightning strike 6 years ago. We rebuilt it then too." Eliza said nothing for a moment. "Then we know it can be rebuilt," she said. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted slightly. Not toward warmth exactly, because they weren't there yet, had not been there yet, but toward something that acknowledged that she was standing in the ashes of his life with him, and not at a safe distance from it, which was something. "I need to go to Ellis today," he said. "Not tomorrow. Today. Drummond be damned. Ellis needs to know what happened last night before someone else tells him a version of it." "Yes," Eliza said, "and I'll go to the Brants. Thomas said the Kowalskis had documents. I need those documents before the judge arrives." 3 weeks, Caleb said. 3 weeks. He went to town. Eliza changed her dress. The one she'd been wearing smelled of smoke and would need soaking, and saddled one of the horses that Miguel had brought back from the north pasture and rode to the Brant farm. Clara Brant saw her coming from the yard and read something in the way she was riding. Not the pace, which was ordinary, but something in the posture, and met her at the fence with an expression that had already moved to concern before Eliza had said a word. "What happened?" Clara said. "The barn burned last night, deliberately, we believe." Clara put her hand to her mouth. "We're all right," Eliza said, getting down. "The horses are out, no one was hurt, but it changes the timeline." She looked at Clara directly. "I need to see the Kowalskis, and anyone else Thomas mentioned, today if possible." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she turned toward the house and called for Thomas. Thomas Brant took her to the Kowalski farm himself, sitting beside her on the wagon with the particular set of a man who has been waiting for something to do and has finally been given it. The Kowalskis, a Polish couple, Stefan and Hannah, who had come to Kansas 12 years ago and had built something out of nothing and had lost most of it in February, received them in their kitchen with the careful hospitality of people who did not have much to offer but offered what they had. Stefan Kowalski's English was limited, and his wife's was better, and they communicated in the shifting, collaborative way of a couple who had learned to divide the labor of a language that neither of them fully owned. He had kept the documents. Of course he had kept them, he said, through Hannah's translation. He did not know why, because there was nothing he could do with them, but throwing away a document that had destroyed your life felt wrong. So he had kept them. Eliza read them. The clause was different in language from the Brant's document, but identical in structure and in the discretionary language that allowed the bank to call the loan. The foreclosure had been in February. The summer before, Kowalski's farm had also had a difficult harvest. The bank's letter citing material decline was undated, or rather, the date on it was in the wrong relation to the date of the notice, suggesting it had been prepared in advance of the actual determination. She read that part again. The letter was prepared before the determination, which meant the determination was not a determination at all. It was a decision made in advance and papered over afterward. "Stefan," she said, looking up, "did the bank send anyone to look at your farm before they sent this letter?" Hannah translated. Stefan shook his head. "Did they contact you at all before the letter arrived?" Another exchange, another headshake. "The letter was the first notice you had?" "Yes," Hannah said. "One morning it was there. 2 weeks later, men came to say we must go." Eliza set the documents down on the table. She looked at them for a moment. Then she said, "May I take copies of these? I will return the originals. I need to show something to a judge." Stefan and Hannah looked at each other. The look was long, and in it was everything that the past year had cost them, and the question of whether anything that cost anything more was worth it. "To get the land back," Stefan said, in English, with the careful deliberateness of a man who wanted to ask this question himself, without translation. Eliza considered whether to lie to him. She decided, as she always decided in these moments, not to. "I don't know," she said. "I don't want to promise you something I'm not certain of. What I can tell you is that what was done to you and to the Brants and to Caleb Walker and to others, it was done the same way, on purpose, by the same people, for the same end. If a judge sees the pattern, he has to respond to it. Whether the land comes back—" She stopped. "I don't know. But if we do nothing, he takes more. And the next family after that." Stefan looked at his wife again. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and the gesture was small and private, the language of a long marriage. "Take the copies," he said. Eliza rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the documents in her bag and the smell of burned wood still faintly in the air as she came up the road and the blackened skeleton of the barn visible against the western sky. Caleb was in the yard. He had started moving things, pulling salvageable lumber from the edges of the ruin, organizing what could be used again and what couldn't, the practical beginning of rebuilding that was also, she understood, a way of managing the anger she'd seen controlled behind his eyes all day. She dismounted and tied the horse and came to stand near him. "Ellis?" she said. He came out this afternoon, looked at the barn, asked questions. Caleb set a blackened board down. He was angry. I could see it. He's not a man who hides things well. He told me Drummond would have to know about the fire, and I said I understood that, and I watched him trying to work out what to do about the fact that telling Drummond was going to accomplish nothing useful. "And?" "He said—" Caleb paused. He was choosing the words. "He said that the circuit judge sometimes communicated through the county land office rather than through the sheriff's department, for certain kinds of land disputes. He said the land office had a clerk who had been there for 20 years, and who was not, these were his words, who was not part of anyone's arrangement." Eliza looked at him. "He's telling us how to reach Harding directly," she said, "without going through Drummond, and without Caldwell knowing until it's too late to do anything about it." She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the thing that lived just before relief, the sense of a path where there had been only ground. "The land office clerk, do you know him?" "His name is Abbott. Old man, been there since before I came to the territory. I've dealt with him a few times on the land registration." Caleb looked at her. "He's honest. The way old men who've been doing the same job for 20 years are honest. Not because it's easy, but because it's the only thing they know how to be." "Then that's where the documents go," Eliza said, "before the judge arrives. Into Abbott's hands, with a letter explaining everything. The accounts, the foreclosures, the pattern, the barn." She looked at the ruins. Everything. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You'll write the letter," he said. "Yes." He picked up another board, examined it, set it in the keep pile. "You know what happens if this doesn't work," he said. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was the question of a man who needed to look at all of it clearly before he committed to a direction. "I know," Eliza said, We'll have shown our hand. He'll know what we had. He'll know we tried. Yes, and if Harding is in Caldwell's pocket too, then we go above Harding, Eliza said. There's a federal land commissioner in Topeka. It will take longer, it will be harder, but the documents don't expire. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was behind him, and the burned barn was behind her, and they were standing in the middle of a piece of land that someone wanted badly enough to burn a barn for, and neither of them looked away. You're not afraid, he said. Not quite an accusation, more like something he was trying to understand. I'm afraid all the time, Eliza said. I was afraid the night I got off the train. I was afraid when I stopped those horses. I was afraid in the barn when the gelding wouldn't move. She looked at him steadily. Being afraid doesn't mean anything, in my experience, except that you understand the situation. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the lumber. I'll start on the frame for the new barn this weekend, he said. Miguel and I. If the Brants want to help, Thomas offered. They'll come, Eliza said. What makes you sure? She looked out at the property, the ruins, the house, the pasture where the horses were grazing in the last of the light, the road that ran east toward a town that had rejected her on the day she arrived, and that she had been, quietly and with great care and over the course of 2 months, learning the inside of. Because they need to see it, she said, the rebuilding. Not just us, them too. All of them who've lost something or who are afraid they will. They need to see that someone started building again after the fire. She paused. That's not nothing. Seeing that, it matters. Caleb did not say anything for a moment. Then quietly, without looking up from the lumber, You're right. She went inside to write the letter to the circuit judge. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned high and Maylene's tea going cold at her elbow, and she wrote. She wrote plainly and precisely, the way her father had taught her to write business documents. No excessive language, no appeal to emotion, only what could be demonstrated and what it demonstrated. She named Harmon. She named the bank. She named the dates. She described the pattern across 4 properties. She cited the clause and the absence of documentation supporting its application. She described the forged letter, the loosened fence, the fire. She did not name Nathan Caldwell directly in the first version. She read what she had written, and she added his name in the second version, because omitting it was a form of protection he hadn't earned, and she was done extending him that courtesy. She finished at midnight. She read it once more and changed 2 words and folded it into the ledger between 2 of the summary pages and put it back in the box. Then she went to the window and stood there for a moment in the dark, looking out at the pasture where the horses were shadows in the moonless night. And she thought about the train platform, and the coin bag, and the 8 months of letters, and the life she had imagined on the other side of the ocean. And she thought about this life, the one she was actually in, with its burned barn and its forged letters, and its 2 people who had become, without fanfare or declaration, something like a family. And she understood that the thing she was fighting for now was not what she had come here looking for. It was something else, something that had no name she'd been taught, that she had found instead of the thing she'd planned, the way you sometimes found the best things, without looking, in the middle of something else, when you were too busy and too tired and too far from everything familiar to notice it happening until it already had. She went back to the cot. She did not sleep for a long time. But the letter was written, and the documents were safe, and the judge was 3 weeks away, and the horses were in the pasture making their quiet nighttime sounds. It was not enough. But it was what there was, and she had learned, was still learning, would be learning for a long time yet, that sometimes what there was and what was enough were, in the end, the same thing. The letter went to Abbott at the land office on a Monday morning, delivered not by Caleb and not by Eliza, but by Miguel, who rode into Millhaven on the kind of errand that nobody watched closely because nobody thought about Miguel closely, which was something Miguel had long understood about the way he moved through this particular world, and had learned to use without bitterness, the way you learn to use whatever tools were available to you. He came back before noon and reported that Abbott had been at his desk, had taken the envelope, had looked at the return address, Caleb Walker, Ranch Road East, and had set it in a specific drawer rather than the general stack, which Miguel had watched carefully enough to note. Abbott had said nothing. He was the kind of man who did not say unnecessary things. But the drawer was significant, Miguel thought, because it was the drawer on the left side of the desk, the one that Abbott had unlocked with a key he kept on his person, rather than hanging on the wall hook with the others. He knew what it was, Miguel said. Or he knew what kind of thing it was, Eliza said. Same result. It was. She filed that away and went back to the letter she was preparing for the land commissioner in Topeka, the one she was writing as a contingency, the backup to the backup. She had learned, on the ship, on the train, in the 8 months of correspondence that had ended on a platform in the dust, that the only plan worth having was one that had somewhere to go when the first path closed. The barn frame went up that weekend. Thomas Brandt came with his 2 oldest sons and his neighbor, a man named Vickers, who had not lost land but who had a loan with the Caldwell Bank and had been watching what was happening around him with the careful attention of someone who understood he might be next. Stefan Kowalski came, which surprised Eliza more than it should have. He was a quiet man, not given to gestures, and driving his wagon out to a ranch where the barn had burned felt like the kind of gesture he would think about for a long time before making. He brought Hannah and their youngest daughter, and Hannah brought food, and the daughter, maybe 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes, sat on the fence rail all morning and watched the men work with the focused intensity of a child who intended to understand how everything was done. Eliza worked alongside the men. She was not as strong as Thomas Brandt's sons, who were big and accustomed to physical labor, but she was useful. She could read the plans Caleb had sketched, and she could hold a beam while it was being set, and she understood the logic of structure, which timber went where and why, which she had learned watching barns built in her village as a child. Caleb noticed this and did not comment on it, which was his way of accepting it. By the end of Saturday, the frame was standing. It was raw and incomplete, and the smell of new wood was strange against the lingering ghost of smoke, but it was standing. They stood around it in the early evening light, Caleb and Miguel and Eliza and the Brandts, and Stefan Kowalski and Vickers and Hannah Kowalski, holding a pot of something that smelled like the best thing Eliza had encountered in recent memory. And nobody made a speech because this was not a group of people given to speeches, but the fact of them standing there together around a frame that had been ruins a week ago was itself something. Hannah's daughter slid off the fence rail and walked to Eliza and stood beside her, looking up at the frame. "Is it going to be bigger than the old one?" she said. Eliza looked at Caleb. He thought about it. "A little," he said. "We're moving the south wall out about 4 feet. The girl nodded as if this was information she'd needed. Then she went back to the fence. After people had eaten and begun the long process of leaving, wagons hitching, goodbyes exchanged in the particular subdued register of people who had worked hard together and were tired, Thomas Brandt found Eliza near the water trough and said, quietly, not looking at her directly, "Vickers is going to talk to 2 other families this week, men he knows. Both of them have had situations with the bank that they haven't said much about." "Their land?" Eliza said. "Not yet, but there's been pressure, a sudden reevaluation of a property, a letter saying an insurance arrangement had lapsed, that kind of thing." Eliza thought about this. Pressure before the move. The same pattern, earlier in the sequence. "Ask them to write it down," she said. "Whatever happened, whatever they received, whatever was said to them. Written, signed, dated. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It just has to be accurate." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You think the judge will listen?" "I think we're giving him something he'd have to work hard to ignore," she said. "Whether he'll do the work of ignoring it, that I can't tell you." He nodded, the same slow nod she'd seen from him before. The nod of a man who had run out of the kind of hope that felt good and was operating on the kind that just kept you moving. "My boys want to come back next weekend," he said. "Finish the walls." "Tell them we'll have the lumber ready," Eliza said. It was in the middle of that second week, with the barn walls half up and the horses back in the expanded paddock area, and the letter sitting in Abbott's locked drawer and the judge 11 days out, that Nathan Caldwell made his first direct move against Eliza herself. She had known it was coming. She had known, from the way he had looked at her across the main street that day in town, that she had been wrong to think of the forged letter and the fire as his final escalations. Those had been moves against the ranch, against Caleb's operation. She had been, in his mind, an accessory to a problem rather than the problem itself. Something had shifted in his calculation of the situation. She didn't know what, whether someone had told him about the ledger or whether he had simply arrived, through whatever intelligence he gathered, at the correct conclusion about who was driving what was happening. But the shift had occurred. She knew it had occurred because of what happened to the school. On Wednesday morning, she arrived at the barn for the children's session to find a man she didn't know standing in the yard. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who dressed well for professional occasions rather than vanity, and he had a document in his hand that he was holding with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to delivering documents. "Miss Varga?" he said. "Yes. I'm representing the Millhaven Town Board. I have a notice here for the property owner regarding the unauthorized operation of an educational establishment." Eliza looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" He held out the document. She took it and read it. It was, in substance, a notice that any educational instruction of minors on private property within the county required a license issued by the town board, and that operation without such a license was in violation of county ordinance, and that the unlicensed activity must cease immediately pending application for and approval of the license. She read it twice. "When was this ordinance passed?" she said. The man blinked. He had not apparently been expecting that question. The ordinance has been on the books for, I would like the date it was passed," Eliza said, "and I would like to see the list of other educational operations in the county that have been served with this notice." He looked at her with the expression of a man whose script had been departed from. "I am simply serving the notice, Miss Varga. Any questions about the ordinance itself would be directed to the town board," Eliza said, "whose members are—" A pause. "The board is chaired by Mr. Nathan Caldwell, and the other members are—" "That's sufficient," Eliza said. "Thank you for delivering this." She went inside and showed the notice to Caleb, who read it with his jaw set in the way it set when he was controlling his temper. "There's no such ordinance," he said. "I suspected not. Or if there is, it's brand new." She sat down. "But that's almost irrelevant. The intent is to stop the school. The mechanism is secondary. Can they actually stop it? They can try to make it costly and complicated and publicly embarrassing. A formal dispute, hearings before the board, which is to say before Caldwell," she thought. "It's designed to make me choose between fighting it and doing everything else that needs doing before the judge arrives." Caleb set the notice on the table. "So he knows about the judge." "He knows about something, whether Abbott—" She stopped. "I don't think it was Abbott. I think it's more likely that someone saw Miguel deliver the envelope, or that Caldwell simply looked at his timeline and understood that if we were going to do anything, we would do it before September." "What do we do about the school?" Eliza thought about the children who had been coming on Saturday mornings. The 14 children, the girl on the fence rail, the boy who had said his father didn't see the point of reading. She thought about Clara Brandt sitting in the corner with her mending, watching what happened with the expression that had shifted from caution to something else. "The school continues," she said. Caleb looked at her. "If they press it, then they press it. A town board compelling the closure of a voluntary school taught by a volunteer teacher to children who have no other options is a fact I would like Judge Harding to be aware of." She picked up the notice and set it in the wooden box with the other documents, which she had moved back from the hiding place now that the ledger had been submitted. "Everything they do now is documentation. They don't seem to understand that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "Or they understand it, and they think it doesn't matter because they believe they can contain whatever documentation we produce." "Then they're wrong," Eliza said. "But yes, it's possible they believe that." She wrote a response to the town board that afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs long. It asked, in the most precise and politely unanswerable language she could construct, for the date of passage of the ordinance in question, for the documentation of other establishments that had been served with identical notices, for the process by which a license application would be evaluated, and by whom, and for the estimated timeline for that evaluation. She did not say she was going to stop the school. She did not say she wasn't. She asked questions. She sent it to the town board via the post office, with a copy retained. She did not hear back before the end of the week. What she heard instead was from Mei Lin, who had gone into town on Thursday and come back with a report that had several components. The first was that Henry Harmon had been seen going into the bank twice in 2 days, which was unusual. He had a standing monthly meeting with the bank, Mei Lin understood from the women she talked to, but twice in 2 days suggested something had been called in. The second thing was more immediate. A man named Garrett, who worked as a clerk for the bank, had been making comments in the places where comments circulated, the barber shop, the back corner of the general store, about the foreign woman at the Walker Ranch who was causing trouble. The nature of the comments Malian described with the flat precision of someone who had heard comments about herself all her life and had learned to report them accurately without allowing them to land too hard. He had said that Eliza was not what she appeared to be, that she had come to Millhaven under false pretenses, that she had used her position at the ranch to involve herself in matters that were not her concern. He had not said anything specific enough to be actionable, but he had said enough to plant the kind of doubt that grew on its own once planted. "He's working on the community," Eliza said, "before the judge arrives. He wants to make sure that if anyone is asked about me, they have a reason to be uncertain." "It's working a little," Malian said. She said it carefully, not cruelly. "Not with everyone, but some of the people who were starting to look at what was happening and consider it, some of them are stepping back." Eliza received this. It was not a surprise. It was, in fact, entirely predictable. She had been waiting for it, the move against her character rather than against the ranch, because she had known from the beginning that she was vulnerable in a way Caleb was not. He was a man with land, with history, with a name that had been in the county for years. She was a foreign woman who had arrived on a train to be someone's wife and had instead ended up at the center of an effort that was making a powerful man uncomfortable. The story he was constructing about her, manipulative, self-interested, an outsider using good people for her own unclear purposes, was not difficult to construct. It had ready materials. She sat with this for the rest of Thursday. On Friday morning, she made a decision. She went into Millhaven herself. Not with Malian, not with Caleb. Alone, on horseback, in the good blue dress that had traveled with her from Eastern Europe and still carried itself, despite everything, with a certain dignity. She rode to the main street and she tied the horse in front of the general store and she went in. The man behind the counter, the same gray-haired man who had turned her away in her first week, looked up when she came in. She bought flour, she bought lamp oil. She bought a small amount of coffee and a length of cotton fabric that Malian had mentioned needing. She paid for each item and she thanked the man for each one, and when he gave her the change, she thanked him again. He said, while wrapping the fabric, "Heard you been teaching some of the children out your way." "Saturday mornings," she said, "reading and arithmetic mostly." He was quiet for a moment. He was wrapping the fabric, but he had slowed down. "The Henshaw boy?" She didn't know a Henshaw boy. "I'm not always certain of all the names," she said honestly. "Brown hair, about 10, asks very good questions?" The gray-haired man looked up. "That'd be Danny. His mother was my niece. She passed 2 years ago." He looked back at the fabric. "His father works the rails. He's not... Danny doesn't have much in the way of someone to help him with his letters." "He's quick," Eliza said. "He understands numbers faster than children twice his age." The man wrapped the fabric in silence for a moment. Then he tied the string around it and set it on the counter. "I didn't treat you well," he said, "when you first came in." Eliza looked at him. "I know why I did it," he said. "It doesn't make it right, I know that. People were talking, and Nathan Caldwell, he has a way of making people understand what he expects." He pushed the wrapped fabric toward her. "I'm not saying this to make myself feel better. I'm just saying it." "I understand," Eliza said. She picked up her purchases. "Tell Danny his arithmetic is very good." She went to 2 more establishments. The dressmaker, where she bought thread. The lunch counter, where she ate a meal slowly and spoke briefly to the woman who ran it, who was Polish. She had not known this before, and the woman had not volunteered it, but something in the way she tilted her head at Eliza's English suggested it. And Eliza had said a word in Polish that she knew, just one, and the woman's face had opened in the way faces opened when they unexpectedly heard something familiar. They talked for 20 minutes, in a mixture of languages, about nothing specific: food, the weather, the quality of the flour from the dry goods store. But by the time Eliza paid for her meal, something had passed between them that was not nothing. She was riding back up the main street when she saw Deputy Ellis. He was coming out of the sheriff's office. He saw her at the same moment. He looked at her and then looked away and then, after a moment that she could see him working through, looked back and gave a small, deliberate nod. She nodded back. It was not much, but it was from a man who was standing in front of the sheriff's office in a town where the sheriff did what Nathan Caldwell wanted and who had nodded at the foreign woman from the Walker Ranch anyway. She rode home. When she arrived, there was a wagon in the yard she didn't recognize, a farm wagon, plain, with a man sitting in the seat who got down when he saw her coming. He was perhaps 60, lean, with the face of a man who had spent a long life outdoors, and whose expression was the particular careful blankness of someone who had come to ask for something and was not sure how it would be received. Caleb was standing nearby in that stance of his that meant he was waiting. "This is Irvin Marsh," Caleb said. "He farms about 6 miles north." Eliza dismounted and tied the horse and looked at Irvin Marsh. "You've been hearing things about me," she said. It wasn't a guess. The careful blankness was specific. "I've been hearing some things," Irvin said. "I've been hearing other things too. I went to the Brants last week. Thomas told me—" He stopped. He was choosing carefully. "I have a letter from the bank, from 3 weeks ago. It says my property assessment has been revised downward, and my loan-to-value ratio is now in a range that requires additional security or partial repayment within 60 days. Eliza was very still. "May I see it?" she said. He reached into his coat and produced the letter. She read it standing by her horse in the yard, with Caleb beside her and Marsh watching her face. The letter was different from the foreclosure documents. This was earlier in the sequence, the pressure stage, the preliminary tightening, the manufactured financial stress that preceded the clause invocation. The assessment had been performed by an assessor appointed by the bank, whose name she did not recognize but filed away, and the revised value was significantly lower than any reasonable market assessment of a 6-mile northern property with a standing farmhouse and outbuildings. "Have you had any bad harvests?" she said. "Had a dry year 2 years ago, same as everyone. This year was fine. Has anyone been to your property to assess it in the past year?" He thought. "A man came in May, said he was from the county, walked the property, looked at the buildings. I didn't think much of it." "Appointed by the bank," she said. "Not the county." He looked at her, then at Caleb. "They're setting it up," Caleb said. "Yes," Eliza said. "You're at an earlier stage than the Brants and the Kowalskis. They lost their land. You're in the window before that, which means there may still be something that can be done." She folded the letter carefully and held it out to him. "Keep this. Make a copy if you can and keep the copy somewhere separate. Do not respond to the bank yet. Give me until the judge arrives, which is 9 days from now." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. He was, she could see, doing the same calculation that everyone did. The calculation about whether this woman with the accent and the complicated history was someone to trust, or whether trusting her was one more thing that would cost him something he couldn't afford. "Thomas Brant said you were worth listening to," he said. "Thomas Brant is generous," she said. "He said you were the one who found what was wrong with the accounts, before Caleb even knew to look." "I was trained for it," she said. "My father kept books." Marsh looked at the letter in his hands. "What are the chances the judge does something?" She was quiet for a moment because she had promised herself she would not give false comfort to people who were in real trouble and who deserved honest answers. "I don't know," she said. "I know what we have is substantial. I know the pattern is clear. I know that what happened to the Brants and the Kowalskis and what's being tried on you and what was tried on this ranch, it's the same mechanism, repeated. A judge looking at all of it at once is looking at something different from a judge looking at any one piece." She paused. "Whether it's enough? That depends on things I can't control. But I can tell you that what I'm bringing to him is the best case that can be made with what exists." Marsh was quiet. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She asked him to write down everything he remembered about the man who had come in May. His appearance, what he said, what he looked at. She asked him to write down the sequence of events. When the letter arrived, what it said, whether he had communicated with the bank since receiving it. She asked him to write it in his own hand, signed and dated. He said he would have it to her within 2 days. He left, and Caleb stood beside her watching the wagon go up the road. 9 days, he said. 9 days. Is it enough? All of it together? She thought about the ledger, the Brant document, the Kowalski documents, the forged letter Caleb had kept a record of, the barn fire, the school notice, the Marsh letter, and whatever the other families Vickers had contacted would produce in the next few days. "It should be," she said. "It's a lot. Weather should be is enough. She shook her head slightly. I stopped knowing the answer to that kind of question a long time ago. The railway accident happened on a Thursday, 6 days before the judge arrived, on the section of track being laid about 8 miles east of Mill Haven. Eliza heard it before she knew what she was hearing, a sound that reached the ranch as a kind of concussive pressure in the air, the particular violence of something structural failing all at once, followed by what might have been shouting but was too far away to be certain. The horses felt it. Copper went sideways in the paddock, and Eliza caught him by instinct and looked east and saw a column of dust rising into the afternoon sky. Caleb had a horse saddled in less than 3 minutes. Stay here, he said. She was already saddling the gray mare. He looked at her. The work crew out there, she said. Half of them are immigrants. They won't be able to communicate with anyone they send. She pulled the girth strap. You know I'm right. He did know she was right. He turned his horse and they went east together. What they found at the construction site was this. A section of raised earthwork had failed, taking with it approximately 30 feet of newly laid track and a work cart loaded with iron rail, and the cart had come down at an angle that had caught 5 men who were working in the cut below. 3 had gotten clear in time, 2 had not. The site was chaos in the specific way of a place where something terrible had happened, and the people responsible for order did not have the tools to create it. There was a foreman, American, shouting in English at men who spoke Polish, Hungarian, Italian, and at least 2 other languages that Eliza could identify by ear and one she could not. The injured men were being attended to by other workers who were doing what they could, but who were hampered by the inability to ask questions or receive answers. One of the injured men was conscious and trying to communicate something, his mouth moving, words coming out, but no one near him spoke whatever he was speaking. Eliza got down from the mare before it had fully stopped. She pushed through the ring of men and knelt beside the conscious man and listened. It was Hungarian. I was telling her where it hurt, his leg, his side. He thought something was broken in his leg. He had not hit his head, but he had fallen on his arm and his arm felt wrong. He was asking about his brother, who had been standing next to him. Eliza looked up at Caleb, who had come up beside her. His leg, possibly his arm. He's asking about his brother. She looked around at the other injured man, who was unconscious. That one, is he breathing? A worker beside the unconscious man looked at her with surprise at being asked, then checked, then nodded. Breathing, Eliza reported in Hungarian. Tell me your brother's name. Andras, the man said. I am Josef. Josef, my name is Eliza. You are going to be all right. We need to move you carefully. Can you tell me if the pain in your side is sharp or dull? She worked through it with him, a basic inventory of what hurt and how, the kind of things she had learned watching her village's closest equivalent to a doctor manage injured farmers over the years. Not medical training, nothing like it, but enough to prioritize what needed attention and what could wait. The foreman was beside her within 2 minutes, having understood that she was doing something useful. What's he saying? The foreman demanded. Zenu, he has a probable broken leg and a suspected arm injury. He's concerned about his brother, who is the unconscious man. The unconscious man is breathing. We need someone to ride for a doctor immediately, and we need to keep both men still until the doctor arrives. The foreman blinked at the volume of organized information. You speak Hungarian? And some Italian and Polish, Eliza said. If you have injured men who speak those, tell me now. It turned out there was a third man, Italian, who had taken a glancing blow from a falling rail section and had a head wound that was bleeding significantly, but who was conscious and terrified and not understanding anything anyone was saying to him. Eliza got to him in 2 minutes with the Italian she had, broken and limited, learned from a family who had lived near her in the village for 3 years, and the combination of her words and her hands and the simple evidence of being understood seemed to be enough to shift his breathing from the fast, panicked rhythm of someone in shock towards something slower and more survivable. Caleb, while she was doing all of this, had organized the practical response. He found 2 men with horses and sent them in opposite directions, one for the doctor in Mill Haven and one toward the next town east that had any kind of medical provision. He got the workers who were unhurt organized into a clearing operation, moving debris carefully away from the injured without moving the injured themselves. He found material for a splint, boards, fabric torn from a work shirt, and brought them to Eliza and let her direct how they were used. She did not stop to think about what she was doing. She did not stop to think about the fact that the crowd of workers around her, men from 6 countries, none of whom she knew, none of whom owed her anything, were listening to her without question, following her directions, handing her what she asked for, because she was the one who understood enough of their languages to ask for it. She did not stop to think about any of that because there was no time, and because the thinking came after, and the work was now. The doctor arrived an hour later. By the time he did, Joseph had been splinted and was calmer. The Italian man's head had been cleaned and bound well enough to have stopped the worst of the bleeding, and the unconscious Andres had regained something like consciousness and had been kept still by the simple expedient of Eliza sitting beside him and talking to him in Hungarian every time he tried to move. The doctor, a compact and brisk man named Pierce, took in the scene in the practiced way of someone who was accustomed to arriving at situations that had been partially managed. "Who's done this?" he said, looking at the splint, the dressings. "We've done what we could," Caleb said. Pierce knelt beside Joseph and examined the leg. He looked at the splint. He looked at Eliza. "You set this?" "I stabilized it. I didn't set it." "You knew not to set it." "I knew enough to know what I didn't know," she said. He made a sound, not approval exactly, but the professional acknowledgement of competence, and went to work. It was past sundown when they rode back to the ranch. Eliza was aware of a tiredness that went past the physical, the kind that accumulated over weeks, and arrived all at once when something urgent was done and there was nothing immediately demanding to replace it. Her hands, she noticed for the first time, had blood on them, dried now, from the Italian man's head wound, and she had not noticed until this moment. They rode in silence for a while. The night was coming in fast, the Kansas sky going from gold to deep blue to the first stars. "The foreman," Caleb said. "He asked me who you were." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you worked at my ranch." He paused. "He said he'd heard of you, the woman from the station." "Everyone's heard of the woman from the station," Eliza said. "He said it differently than I expected." Caleb looked at the road ahead of them. He said he had a lot of men who couldn't be helped by anyone in Millhaven when something went wrong, because nobody spoke what they spoke. He said you were the first person he'd seen who could. Eliza said nothing for a moment. "He asked if you were available as I don't know what the right word is, a consultant for the crew." "What did you tell him?" "I said I'd ask you." She looked at the dark plain around them. The stars were fully out now, the Kansas sky doing its enormous, indifferent thing above everything that happened below it. "Tell him yes," she said. When they arrived at the ranch, Maylin was at the door. She had a particular expression that Eliza had learned to read, the controlled face that held something. "You have a visitor," she said. The man inside was young, Ellis, the deputy. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and a look that was the opposite of whatever Eliza had been hoping for. It was the look of someone who had bad news and had been sitting with it for an hour, working out how to say it. Caleb came in behind Eliza and saw him and stopped. "What happened?" Caleb said. Ellis set his hat on the table. "Abbott," he said, "the land office clerk." Eliza was very still. "He's all right," Ellis said quickly. "He's not hurt, but—" He stopped. He looked at the table, then back up. "Someone went through the land office last night, after hours. The door was opened. The lock was worked, not broken, so whoever did it knew what they were doing. Abbott found it this morning. He says most things were untouched." He paused. The left desk drawer was opened. The room was silent. "Was the envelope there?" Eliza said. Ellis looked at her. "No, but that's—" He reached into his coat. "That's because Abbott moved it 2 days after it came in. He didn't like the look of things, and he moved it. He's had it at his house." He placed on the table a receipt, a formal document in Abbott's handwriting, acknowledging the receipt of a sealed envelope from Caleb Walker, dated, witnessed by Abbott himself, and by one other name she didn't recognize. "He made a receipt?" Caleb said. "He made a receipt," Ellis said. "He's been doing this job for 22 years. He said when a man brings him a sealed letter addressed to a circuit judge with a request for confidential delivery, and that man's barn has recently burned, he makes a receipt." Eliza looked at the receipt for a long moment. Then she sat down. Not dramatically, just the sitting down of a person who had been running on something insufficient for a long time, and whose legs had quietly decided that this particular moment was acceptable for a pause. "He's safe," she said. "The documents are safe." "Abbott said to tell you." Ellis glanced at Caleb, then back at her. "He said to tell you that Judge Harding arrives Friday, and that the letter is already in his packet." Harding arrived in 5 days. The letter was already in his packet, which meant Harding had read it or would read it before he arrived, or would arrive knowing it was there waiting to be discussed, and the discussion would happen on ground that Eliza had prepared rather than ground that Nathan Caldwell had spent 20 years cultivating. It was not over. She knew that. There was a very long way still to go, and Harding might be half Caldwell's, and might be fully Caldwell's, and might be the honest man she needed him to be. There was no way to know yet. But the letter had gotten through. She looked at Ellis across the table. He was young, she thought, really very young, with the face of a man who had entered a difficult situation with his values intact and was finding the maintenance of those values more complicated than he'd anticipated. She felt something toward him, not fondness exactly, but the particular regard you felt for someone who was trying, in difficult conditions, to be the thing they set out to be. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The information about Abbott, coming tonight." Ellis looked at his hat. "I couldn't—" He stopped. "I've been watching what's been happening here for a while. Before your letter, even. There were things I could see, and I didn't—" He stopped again. "I should have done more, sooner." "You're doing something now," Caleb said. "I'm sitting in your kitchen telling you things," Ellis said. "I want to be clear that's the extent of what I can do officially while Drummond is sheriff. If the judge acts, if there's something formal, something with authority behind it, I'll be the first person to move on it. But until then, I can't—" "We know," Eliza said. "We're not asking you to risk your position. What you've given us is enough." He left shortly after, with the careful departure of a man trying not to be seen, and they heard his horse going quietly up the road. Maylene set the kettle on without being asked. They sat around the kitchen table, Caleb and Eliza and Maylene and Miguel, who had come in from the barn while Ellis was talking and had stood near the door with his arms crossed and his face doing the careful thing it did when he was listening and not wanting to miss anything. 5 days, Maylene said. 5 days, Eliza said. What does Caldwell do in 5 days? Eliza thought about it honestly. He had tried the fence, the forged letter, the fire, the school notice, the campaign against her character. He had tried to get to the documents through the land office and found they weren't there. He knew the judge was coming, and he likely knew, by now, that something had been submitted through channels he hadn't controlled. What did a man do in 5 days when the thing he'd been preventing was coming anyway? He'll try to discredit me, she said, specifically, directly, and publicly. What he's done so far has been oblique, comments in barbershops, a man serving notices. In the time he has left, I think he'll try to do something that creates a formal record of doubt about who I am and what I'm doing here. A legal challenge of some kind, Caleb said. Possibly. Or simply a public statement, something in the newspaper, something that means when the judge asks around about the woman who signed these documents, the first thing he hears is a question about her credibility. The kitchen was quiet. The kettle started to make its preliminary sounds. Then we make sure he hears other things first, Maylene said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the table with the focused expression she had when she had thought something through. The railway foreman, she said, the families who came to rebuild the barn. Clara Brandt. The man at the general store. I heard what he said to you today. These are people who know who you are. What they say about you matters. She looked up. We can't control what Caldwell does, but we can make sure there are enough voices saying something different that his voice is not the only one. Eliza looked at her for a moment. I'm not going to ask people to speak on my behalf, she said. I can't do that. You wouldn't be asking, Maylene said. You've been doing things for these people for weeks. I'm saying we let them know what's coming, not to defend you, to be counted. There's a difference. The kettle was boiling. Maylene got up and made the tea. Eliza sat at the table and thought about what Maylene had said. There was a part of her that resisted it, the part that had grown up being told that asking for anything was a kind of weakness, that what you built had to be built on your own labor and not on anyone else's sense of obligation. But she was also 31 years old and had crossed an ocean and had been learning month by month and week by week in this particular piece of the American frontier, that the things she'd been told were not always the truest things available. What Mei Lin was describing was not debt or obligation. It was community. It was the thing that formed when people saw each other clearly and chose, on that basis, to act. She had not expected to find that here. She had not expected to find any of what she had found here. "All right," she said. Mei Lin set the tea on the table. 4 cups, placed without ceremony in front of 4 people who were, in their way, all from somewhere else, all in a position they hadn't anticipated, all doing what could be done with what was available. 5 days, Miguel said. It was the first thing he'd said all evening, and he said it with the calm certainty of a man who had waited longer than that for things that mattered. Outside, the Kansas night was doing what it always did, large and dark and indifferent to the small, urgent human things happening beneath it. The horses in the paddock were settled. The frame of the new barn stood against the stars. 5 days. Judge Harding arrived on a Friday morning on the same train line that had brought Eliza to Millhaven 14 weeks earlier. She did not go to the station to watch him arrive. She had thought about it, had felt the pull of something symmetrical in the idea of standing on that platform again, on her own terms this time. But she decided against it. The judge was not an occasion. He was a mechanism, like everything else, and mechanisms required careful handling rather than ceremony. She stayed at the ranch and finished her review of the documents one final time. Caldwell had made his move on Wednesday, 2 days before Harding arrived. It had been what she predicted, a letter to the Millhaven Courier, published in the weekly edition, signed by Nathan Caldwell in his capacity as chairman of the town board. It described, in the measured and reasonable language of a man who knew how to sound measured and reasonable, a concern about certain activities taking place on private property in the ranch district, unlicensed educational operations, interference in bank proceedings by unqualified parties, and the involvement of a foreign national of uncertain background and unclear motive in matters pertaining to the legal and financial affairs of the county. He did not call her dishonest in so many words. He arranged the words so that dishonesty was the shape left by what he didn't say. She read it once. She put it in the box with the other documents. She did not read it again. What happened in the 2 days between that letter and Harding's arrival was something she had not entirely anticipated, though Mei Lin had. The railway foreman, whose name was Gus Peterson, appeared at the ranch on Wednesday afternoon with a piece of paper he had written himself, in a hand that was functional rather than elegant, which stated that on a specific date in September, he had witnessed Eliza Varga provide competent and organized assistance to injured workers of multiple nationalities at a construction accident site, that her ability to communicate across language lines had materially aided in the care of those workers prior to the arrival of medical assistance, and that in his professional judgment, she was a person of reliable character and practical capability. He had signed it and had 3 of his workers sign it also. He handed it to Eliza without a speech. "It's not fancy," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "That's better than fancy." He nodded and went back to his wagon. Clara Brandt came the same afternoon with a letter she had written herself, which described what she had observed at the Saturday school sessions. The children, the methods, the change she had seen in her own sons over the course of 8 weeks. She had gotten the woman from the lunch counter to sign it too, and the woman from the lunch counter had added 2 sentences in her own hand, in Polish, which Clara had asked Eliza to translate before the document was finalized so they knew what it said. It said, "This woman treated me like a person from the first day. That is not common here." Thomas Brandt brought the Kowalski letter. Irvin Marsh brought his own. A man Eliza had never met, a farmer named Cole, who Vickers had contacted, sent a note through his neighbor describing the bank's approach to his property and asking to be included in whatever was being submitted to the judge. She added everything to the packet. She organized it in the order she had planned, with her original letter and ledger summary at the front, the financial documentation in the middle, and the testimonies at the back. She tied it with string and wrote, on the front cover in her cleanest hand, "For the attention of Circuit Judge Harding, submitted by Eliza Varga and Caleb Walker, Walker Ranch, Millhaven County." Abbott had already delivered the original packet to Harding's review materials. This was the supporting volume. She delivered it herself, in person, to the land office on Thursday morning. Abbott received it with the same wordless efficiency with which he had received everything from her, looked at the cover, placed it in the same locked drawer that had been broken into and had yielded nothing because Abbott was a man who thought ahead and gave her a second receipt. She thanked him. He said, "The judge holds his first session Monday." "I'll be there," she said. She was. The session was held in the building that served as the county courthouse when a judge was present, which was a room at the back of the town hall that smelled of old paper and was furnished with a long table, a row of chairs along the wall, and a large window that let in the September light in long, dusty angles. It was not an imposing room, but it had the authority of a place where formal things happened, and the people who filled it on Monday morning, Eliza and Caleb and Thomas Brandt and Stefan Kowalski and Irvin Marsh, and Ellis the deputy who had come in his official capacity and was standing near the door with the careful posture of a man who intended to be noticed as present, all felt that authority and the particular straightening of their spines that courtrooms produced. Nathan Caldwell was there too. He was seated across the room with his attorney, a man who had come from Topeka, which told Eliza something, and Henry Harmon beside him. Caldwell was composed. He was, she thought, almost always composed, which was one of the things that made him effective, and also one of the things that made him, in the end, not quite as dangerous as he believed himself to be. Composure was valuable, but it could also make a man confident in situations that required him to be worried. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Judge Harding was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone larger, somehow, or more obviously weighty. I was a slight man of perhaps 65, with glasses and the particular economy of movement of someone who had been doing complicated work for a long time and had learned not to waste energy on the parts that didn't matter. He came in without ceremony, sat down, opened the packet on the table in front of him. She recognized her cover page, and looked at the room over the top of his glasses. "I've read the submitted materials," he said. "I have questions for all parties. We will proceed in order. Mr. Walker, Miss Varga, you submitted first, so we begin with you." What followed was 3 hours of the most demanding conversation Eliza had participated in since she arrived in America. Harding was precise. He asked about the ledger methodology, how she had identified the discrepancies, what her accounting training was, how she had cross-referenced the delivery records. He asked about the Brandt and Kowalski documents, whether she had coached the families on what to say, whether the documents were produced independently. He asked about the timing of events, the fence, the forged letter, the fire, and whether she could demonstrate connection to any specific party. She answered each question the same way, with what she knew, with what she could demonstrate, and with a clear acknowledgement of what she could not prove. She did not overclaim. She did not perform. She said, "Here's what the numbers show. Here's what the documents show. Here's the pattern that emerges when you look at all of it together. I am not telling you what to conclude. I am showing you what is there." Caldwell's attorney challenged the ledger's admissibility on the grounds that it had been compiled by a party with personal grievance. Harding looked at the attorney over his glasses and said that the methodology was sound and the source of the grievance was part of what was being examined and moved on. Harmon was called. He was a poor witness, not because he was stupid, but because he was frightened, which produced the specific failure mode of a man who tried to say too little and said too much in the process. He denied the payments. He denied knowing what the payments were for. He denied any connection to Nathan Caldwell beyond the normal business relationship of men in the same county. Each denial was specific in a way that undercut the one before it, because a man who is not guilty does not know which specific things to deny. Harding watched Harmon and wrote things down. Caldwell himself was composed throughout his testimony. He was, Eliza thought, the best version of the opponent she had imagined. Intelligent, prepared, with answers for most things, and graceful non-answers for the rest. His attorney had clearly spent time with him. He had an explanation for the ledger discrepancies, a bookkeeping error by a former employee, which the bank had already identified and was in the process of correcting. He had an explanation for the foreclosures, legitimate business decisions, properly documented, made in the ordinary course of banking operations. He had an explanation for the barn fire. He expressed condolences about the loss and suggested it might have been the result of dry conditions and poor maintenance. He said all of this with the even, regretful tone of a man who found it unfortunate that things had been allowed to get so confused. But the documents were there. All of them. The pattern was visible in them the way a pattern was always visible once you had enough data points. Not in any single piece, but in the accumulation, in the shape made by 41 discrepancies and 4 foreclosures, and 1 forged letter and a school notice served 3 weeks before a circuit judge arrived, and the statements of 6 families who had experienced the same sequence of events in the same order from the same institution. Harding recessed at noon and resumed at 2. When he came back, he looked different, not dramatically. He was still slight, still economical, still wearing the same glasses. But something in his posture had the quality of a man who had been thinking hard about something and had arrived at a position. He spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke about the documentation, the pattern it established, and the legal standards applicable to the conduct of a lending institution in the Kansas Territory. He spoke about the foreclosure proceedings and the specific deficiencies he had identified in the process by which the material decline clause had been invoked. He spoke about the forged letter and the fire in terms that were careful. He could not, he said, make a finding of direct causation without further investigation, but in terms that made clear these events were not, in his assessment, incidental to the matters before him. Then he said that he was ordering a formal examination of the Caldwell Bank's lending records for the preceding 3 years, to be conducted by an examiner appointed by the territorial government. He said that the foreclosures on the Brandt and Kowalski properties were suspended pending that examination. He said that Henry Harmon was required to appear before a formal inquiry within 30 days. He said one more thing. He said it looking not at either side of the room but at the documents on the table in front of him, as if he was addressing the paper itself rather than the people. He said that the county of Millhaven had certain obligations to its residents regardless of their national origin, and that his court was placing on the record that those obligations had not, by the evidence before him, been fulfilled. The room was quiet after he finished. Then it was not quiet, because rooms did not stay quiet after things like that. And the particular noise that followed was the noise of people absorbing something they had not been certain would happen. Eliza sat still. She had expected relief, or satisfaction, some clean, earned feeling. What she actually felt was more complicated than that and less dramatic, something closer to the deep tiredness that came after something long and difficult was resolved, not happily exactly, but honestly. The way a wound felt when it stopped being acute and started being something you would carry forward. She felt Caleb beside her, and she looked at him, and he was looking at the table with an expression she recognized as the one he used when something had affected him significantly, and he was not ready to speak about it yet. She did not say anything. She let the quiet between them exist. Across the room, Nathan Caldwell was speaking quietly to his attorney. His composure was still intact. She did not expect it to crack here, in this room. He was not that kind of man. The cracking, if it happened, would happen in private, over months, as the examination proceeded and the findings accumulated and the particular structure he had built over years began to show what it was made of. She did not feel triumph about this. She had thought she might. She had imagined, in darker moments over the previous weeks, the specific satisfaction of watching Nathan Caldwell understand that the woman he threw coins at on a train platform had been the instrument of his accounting. She had imagined that satisfying. It wasn't, particularly. What she felt, looking at him across the room, was something simpler and more final. She was done with him. Not because he was defeated. The examination would take time, and he had resources and connections, and the outcome was not guaranteed even now, but because her life had moved past the point where he was the central fact of it. He had been, for 3 months, the shape around which everything else arranged itself. He was no longer that. The shape was different now, and he was only one detail in it. She turned away from him and looked at Thomas Brandt, who was shaking Caleb's hand. She looked at Stefan Kowalski, who was standing near the wall with his wife, and looking at the room with the expression of someone who had stopped expecting justice a long time ago and had not yet fully adjusted to having been wrong about that. She looked at Ellis, who caught her eye from his position near the door and gave the same small, deliberate nod he had given her on the main street, the one that cost him something to give and that he gave anyway. She looked at all of this and she understood something about it that she had not had the language for until this moment. She had come to America looking for a place to belong. That was the honest version of it, underneath the practical arrangements and the letters and the agency in New York. She had wanted what most people wanted, to be somewhere that held her, that had room for who she was, that would not require her to be less than what she was in order to be accepted into it. What she had found instead was this: belonging was not a place you arrived at. It was not something a man could give you or take away by throwing coins at your feet. It was built, slowly and with difficulty and with other people who were also building, out of the ordinary materials of showing up and working and being honest about what you knew and what you didn't, and staying when leaving would have been easier. The place had not accepted her. She had made a place which was not the same thing and was, she thought, considerably more durable. Outside, after the session ended, in the September light that lay long and gold across the main street of Millhaven, she stood for a moment on the steps of the town hall. Maitland was waiting at the wagon. She had not been allowed inside. She had not been called as a witness, had not been part of the formal proceedings. And she had waited outside for 3 hours without complaint, which was the kind of thing Maitland did, and which Eliza had long stopped finding remarkable and started finding simply something she relied on. She walked down the steps and stood beside her. "Well?" Maitland said. "He ordered an examination," Eliza said. "Formal, territorial level. The Brandt and Kowalski foreclosures are suspended." Maitland was quiet for a moment. Her face did the thing it did when something mattered, and she was deciding how much of that to show. "And Caldwell?" "He's still standing," Eliza said. "He'll still be standing for a while. This isn't done." "But it started." "Yes, it started." Maitland looked at the main street. A woman was coming out of the general store. 2 men were talking in front of the hardware outfitter. The ordinary afternoon life of a town, proceeding as it always had. "I want to go home," Maitland said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Me too." They drove back to the ranch in the slanted afternoon light, with the horses keeping their pace and the September plain opening around them, and neither of them said very much because there wasn't very much that needed saying. The hard part was behind them, and the next hard part had not started yet. And in the space between those two things, there was something rare enough to be treated carefully: the ordinary, unremarkable fact of moving through the world without immediate crisis. Eliza held the reins and felt the particular aliveness of hands that had been busy for a very long time. The barn was 3/4 complete. She could see it from the road, the new walls, the frame of the roof in progress, the smell of cut lumber that had replaced the smell of ash. It was not the same barn. It would never be the same barn, and she didn't think it should be. Caleb was already there when they arrived. He had ridden ahead while she and Mei Lin took the wagon. He was in the yard, looking at the new structure with his arms crossed and a coffee cup in his hand that had probably been sitting in the kitchen waiting for him. He heard the wagon and turned. He didn't say anything about the session. He had been there, had heard everything she'd heard. What he said was, "Miguel says the east wall needs 1 more day. We can start on the roof frame Thursday." "Thursday," Eliza said. She got down from the wagon. He looked at her for a moment. "You did something today," he said. It was not elegant, but it was Caleb. "We did something," she said. He accepted this correction with the small movement of his head that meant he disagreed but was choosing not to argue. They went inside. The examination ran through the winter. It was conducted by a territorial examiner named Forsyth, who was in his 40s and methodical, and who, upon seeing Eliza's original ledger, spent 40 minutes asking her questions about methodology, with the focused intensity of a professional recognizing work done properly by someone not expected to do it properly. She answered his questions the same way she had answered Harding's, with what she knew and with honesty about the limits of it. By January, Forsyth had found discrepancies that went further back than Eliza's ledger, another 18 months of similar patterns across not 4 but 7 properties. Henry Harmon made a formal agreement with the territorial authority that included repayment to the bank accounts that had been falsely drawn down, in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution, which Eliza thought was too lenient and which she also understood was how these things worked and was not the last word. The Brandt land was formally restored in February. The Kowalski situation was more complicated. The land had already been transferred to a holding entity connected to the bank, and the untangling of that took most of the spring and the sustained involvement of a land attorney in Topeka. But by May, they had an agreement that returned the majority of the property and provided compensation for the season lost. Nathan Caldwell resigned from the bank board in March. He did not leave Millhaven. I was not arrested. The examiner found the fraud was structured in a way that involved Harmon as the direct actor in Caldwell's involvement while clear to anyone looking at the full picture, was difficult enough to establish criminally that the territorial attorney chose not to pursue it. This was a fact that sat in Eliza's chest for a long time in a way that never became comfortable. She had learned by then that justice and its outcomes were rarely the same shape as the wrong that had prompted them. She had learned this before, in smaller ways, but she learned it again here, more thoroughly. What she also learned was this: Caldwell, without the bank's backing, without the sheriff's compliance, Drummond resigned in November, replaced by a man the county elected in a special vote, and Deputy Ellis stood in that election and won by 11 votes. And without the community's fear was a smaller man than he had appeared. Not harmless, not gone, but smaller. The school was formalized in the spring. A proper building was funded in part by a county allocation. The new board, which no longer had Caldwell as its chair, and in part by the families whose children had been attending Saturday mornings in the barn. Eliza taught there through that year and helped train the woman who replaced her, a young teacher from Missouri who arrived in 1877 with her own accent and her own history and her own set of things to prove, and whom Eliza met at the train station personally, because she understood what it meant to arrive somewhere new and have someone meet you. The barn was finished in October of that first year. They put the horses in and it smelled right, hay and animals and the particular warmth of a working space. And Eliza stood in the entrance with a lamp the way she had stood in the entrance of the old barn on her first morning, listening to the horses settle. Caleb came to stand beside her. They had become, over the course of that year, something that neither of them had a ready word for, and neither of them had rushed to name. Something built the same way the barn was built: frame first, then walls, then roof, each stage requiring the previous one to be solid before it could hold anything. It was not the marriage she had imagined in the letters, the organized beginning she had planned for. It was what happened instead of that plan, which was, she had come to understand, not the same as a lesser thing. He did not say anything for a while. They stood there together in the lamp's circle of light, listening to the horses. "Better than the old one?" he said. She thought about the barn that had burned, the one his wife had helped him build, 6 months pregnant, handing him boards. "Different," she said. "Not better, different." He nodded. He understood the distinction. She thought about what the station platform had looked like 14 weeks after her arrival, the day after Harding's session, when she had ridden into town alone and stood on the platform for a few minutes in the morning quiet. No particular reason. Just to be there. Just to stand in the place where the thing that had seemed like the end of everything had turned out to be. As these things turned out to be when you stayed long enough to find out, only the beginning. She had stood on the platform with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the place where the coin bag had landed in the dust. And she had thought about all the ways she could have left. The morning after the platform, with the coins. The week she found no work. The night the fence was loosened. The night the barn burned. At any of those moments, leaving would have been the reasonable, self-protective choice. Leaving would have been what most people would have understood. She had not left. And what she had found, on the other side of not leaving, was not the life she had planned. It was not the comfortable banker's house and the organized beginning and the future that had existed in vivid detail in her imagination all the way across the ocean. It was something harder and more specific and considerably more hers than that. The voice they had mocked on that platform, the accent that had been held up as evidence of her foreignness, her unsuitability, her not belonging, had turned out to be one of the most valuable things she possessed in this territory. It was the thing that could reach Joseph in the dust of a construction accident. It was the thing that had calmed 7 horses in a burning barn. It was the thing that had opened a door at the lunch counter, had built a school, had helped a family in a kitchen in Polish tell a judge something that mattered. They hadn't silenced it. They had only ensured she would use it. There was a lesson in that, she thought, though she was suspicious of lessons that arrived too cleanly. The real version of it was messier. The real version was, some things that people use against you are actually about them, not about you, and the only way to discover which is to refuse to accept their assessment as final. The accent was not a flaw. It never had been. It was only ever a flaw in the imagination of a man standing on a platform who had decided, in advance of meeting her, what kind of woman he needed and what that woman was allowed to sound like. She had not changed to prove him wrong. She had simply continued to be herself, in full, in the place where he had thrown her away. And the place had changed around her, That was not a story about triumph. It was a story about staying, about the particular stubbornness of a woman who had come a long way and refused to let one man's cruelty be the last word about where she belonged, about the people who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to show them that a different kind of community was possible. She had not built it alone. That was the other thing. She had Mei Lin, who had known her own version of this story before Eliza arrived, and who had waited with great patience for someone to build it with. She had Miguel, who had decided after watching her with the horses for 3 days that she was worth trusting and had never revisited that decision. She had Caleb, who had seen courage in a woman talking horses down from a bolt and had offered her a room and $7 a month and had given her, without intending to, a place from which to do everything that followed. None of it was smooth. None of it was resolved neatly. The territory was still the territory, hard, arbitrary, organized in ways that favored people who already had power. The examination had addressed one mechanism of one man. There were others. There would always be others. But there were also 14 children who could read, and a new barn, and a community of people who had seen what happened when someone refused to leave, and a deputy who had won an election by 11 votes because he had stood at a kitchen table and told the truth when it would have been easier not to. These things were not nothing. Eliza turned from the barn and looked out at the ranch in the dark. The house with its lit window, the paddock, the road running east toward a town that was not what it had been when she arrived in it. The Kansas night was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent, the stars more than you could count. She thought, I did not find what I was looking for. And then, I found something that required more of me, and held more of me, and is therefore more mine. She picked up the lamp. She went inside.